Oh my God, how can you do that at this age?
Let me tell you about a machine that broke the spirits of the best mechanics on the West Coast. We're talking about a 1986 Harley-Davidson FXR, a motorcycle that felt less like a broken piece of machinery and more like a cursed relic. Every custom shop in California had taken a swing at bringing this 40-year-old beast back to life, and every single one of them failed. It was dead, completely and utterly unfixable. But as you and I are about to find out, sometimes it takes a completely different kind of mechanic to break a curse like that. These were no your average backyard mechanics backing away from the job either. We are talking about grown, heavily tattoo-ed men who built custom choppers for a living. Guys who were used to dealing with the roughest crowds imaginable, but they still cowered in absolute fear when a notorious enforcer from the local motorcycle club rolled into their driveway. This giant of a man did not ask nicely. He demanded that this stubborn piece of American steel be repaired immediately, and you did not say no to a man wearing those particular patches on his leather vest. The tension inside that shop was so thick you could choke on it. The silence stretched out heavy and dangerous while the mechanics stared at the ground. Yet right when things were about to reach a boiling point, the shadows in the corner of the garage shifted. Out stepped a scrawny, ragged 8-year-old kid. He looked like he barely weighed 60 pounds soaking wet, holding a broom handle like a shield. He looked right past the terrifying biker, broke that heavy silence, and said 3 simple words. "I will fix it." Let us rewind just a little bit to see how we got to that impossible moment. The midday sun was beating down without an ounce of mercy on the cracked asphalt of Oakland, California. It was the kind of dry, blistering summer heat that practically bakes the grease right into your skin and makes the horizon shimmer like a mirage. The streets were quiet, mostly because sensible folks were hiding indoors near their box fans, leaving the scorching pavement to bake under the blinding light of a cloudless afternoon sky. Those heat waves radiating off the blistering street played tricks on the eyes. As you looked down the block, the approaching pack of motorcycles looked exactly like dark phantoms rising straight up from the molten earth. They drifted in and out of focus through the haze. But there was absolutely nothing ghostly about the sound. The deep, guttural roar of unbaffled V-twin engines echoed off the brick buildings, shaking the windows and rattling the street signs. It was a mechanical thunderstorm, and it confirmed that these riders were very, very real. It was just an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of slow, dragging day where the hours feel like they stretch on forever. Most of the mechanics were just trying to push through the afternoon slump, sipping lukewarm coffee and wiping sweat from their foreheads. Nothing spectacular ever happens on a Tuesday, right? It is usually just about clocking hours, turning wrenches, and waiting for the weekend. But this specific Tuesday was about to shatter that routine completely, bringing a storm of heavy leather and chrome right to their front door. The rumbling grew louder until the source finally pulled into view. The local chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was descending directly upon Apex Ironworks. They rode in tight, disciplined formation, a rolling wave of black denim, scuffed leather, and gleaming chrome. They did not slow down or hesitate as they rumbled past the Cha-in link fence and completely took over the parking lot. It looked like an invading army arriving to lay claim to the property, shutting down the entire block just by showing up and killing their heavy engines. You have to understand that Apex Ironworks was not just some run-down shack in an alleyway. It was known as the most reputable custom motorcycle garage in the entire Bay Area. The place you went when nobody else could solve your mechanical problems. Leading this imposing pack of riders right up to the main bay doors was Jim Mercer. Jim was a literal mountain of a man. He had shoulders as wide as a doorframe and a thick, tangled beard the exact color of steel wool that made him look like a grizzly bear riding on 2 wheels. Jim was not just a weekend rider who liked to play tough. He was a deeply respected, battle-hardened veteran enforcer for the club. When there were problems that needed solving outside the bounds of polite conversation, Jim was the man they called. He had spent decades earning his reputation on the asphalt, handling disputes and protecting the honor of his brothers with a terrifying efficiency. Just the sight of his boots hitting the pavement was usually enough to make folks reconsider their life choices and offer up a quick apology. His heavy leather cut was cracked and deeply weathered from countless miles on the highway. Right on the back, it bore the infamous winged death's head patch, completely fading from years of sun and rain. Up front, you could clearly see the filthy few insignia stitched into the heavy leather. Those specific patches were not bought in a gift shop. They signified decades of absolute, unwavering loyalty to his brotherhood, serving as a permanent map of a hard life lived entirely on his own, dangerous, uncompromising terms. Most people saw Jim coming and immediately braced themselves for an ugly confrontation. But today, against all odds, Jim Mercer was not actually looking to bust any heads or start a brawl in the parking lot. His massive shoulders were slumped just a fraction of an inch, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with violence. He was showing up at the best shop in Oakland because he was desperately looking for a miracle. He needed someone with enough skill and magic in their hands to do the one thing his own club brothers had failed to accomplish. Right behind Jim's rumbling chopper, moving at a slow crawl, was a heavy-duty Ford flatbed truck. Strapped down securely to the wooden bed with heavy yellow cargo ratchets was the true reason for this menacing midday procession. Every single rider in the pack kept casting protective, mournful glances toward the back of that truck, as if they were escorting a fallen king. The cargo sitting silently on the flatbed was the entire focal point of the afternoon. The very thing that was about to push the mechanics inside to the absolute brink of despair. Secured tightly in the center of that truck bed was the 1986 Harley-Davidson FXR. It sat there, perfectly still, an impressive chunk of Milwaukee iron that had seen none miles of open road and countless storms. The FXR frame is famous among real riders for its incredible handling and pure performance, built for carving canyons and outrunning trouble. But right now, it just looked heavy and lifeless. The engine was completely cold, the tires were motionless, and the whole machine carried an eerie, almost oppressive silence around it. Now, if you or I were just walking by on the sidewalk, we probably would not look twice at the thing. To the untrained eye, it honestly looked like nothing more than an old beat-up motorcycle that had been ridden hard and put away wet. The heavy black paint on the gas tank was heavily chipped and faded from years of abuse. The once gleaming chrome on the exhaust pipes and the engine covers was heavily pitted and dusted with a layer of rust. It looked like a prime candidate for a scrapyard, completely devoid of any obvious value or importance. But we are going to look closer, because you and I need to understand what this really meant to the men standing in that parking lot. To the tough, hardened guys wearing the winged death's head on their backs, this specific motorcycle was absolutely priceless. It was a literal holy relic, treated with the kind of reverence most people reserve for a church altar. Every scratch on the fender and every dent in the tank told a story of brotherhood, rebellion, and survival. It was a living piece of their club history. And right now, that history was broken. This wasn't just any club bike passed down through the ranks. It had belonged to a man named Dutch Sullivan. Dutch was a legendary figure in the biker world, serving as the former chapter president for over 2 decades. He was the kind of leader who built empires and kept the chaotic brotherhood together through pure force of will. But tragically, Dutch had passed away just 3 months prior, leaving a massive void in the local biker scene. His sudden death shook the whole community, and his motorcycle was the last physical piece of him left behind. To honor their fallen leader, the club was busy organizing a truly massive memorial run. This was not going to be some quiet little Sunday cruise around the block to pay their respects. They were calling in favors from chapters all across the country, gathering riders from every corner of the map to come together for one massive display of unity and strength. They wanted to rattle the windows of every town they passed through, making absolutely sure that the entire state of California remembered exactly who Dutch Sullivan was and what he meant to them. They were planning a massive 1,000-bike procession sweeping all the way down the sunny California coast to honor Dutch's memory properly. But biker tradition is strict, and tradition loudly dictated that Dutch's personal motorcycle had to be the one leading the entire pack of 1,000 screaming engines. His spirit needed to ride at the very front of the roaring formation, guiding his brothers down the highway one final time. It was a beautiful, deeply poetic sentiment that meant everything to these men. There was just one massive, glaring problem. The 1986 FXR was completely and utterly dead. And we are not just talking about a fouled spark plug or a flooded carburetor here. It was far beyond mechanically broken. The bike genuinely felt like it was actively cursed, fighting back against anyone who tried to put a wrench on it. Countless talented club mechanics had already spent late nights bleeding over the engine block, burning their fingers, and testing every wire, only to walk away completely defeated. The machine refused to fire up, guarding its silence like a stubborn ghost. As the menacing caravan pulled off the street and into the lot of Apex Ironworks, the massive heavy bay doors were already rolled wide open to fight the oppressive summer heat. Standing right in the center of the concrete floor was the shop's owner and head mechanic, a seasoned guy known to everyone simply as Rusty. He watched the bikers swarm his property, his face tight with anxiety, slowly wiping his deeply grease-stained hands on a frayed red shop rag. He knew exactly why they were there, and the knot in his stomach was pulling tighter by the second. Rusty was not some amateur turning wrenches in his driveway for beer money. He was an absolute master of his craft, a mechanical wizard who had spent 30 years learning exactly how engines breathed and burned. He could listen to a motor idling from a block away and tell you exactly which valve was ticking. His walls were covered in magazine features and trophies from bike shows, proving to anyone who walked in that he was the best in the business. If a piece of machinery was physically capable of running, Rusty was the man who could make it happen. He was a man who had successfully built custom $100,000 choppers for Hollywood celebrities, and in the very same week, fixed battered road bikes for dangerous outlaws. He did not care about your background. He only cared about the iron. The golden rule of his garage was incredibly simple. If an engine required air, fuel, and spark to run, Rusty could absolutely make it roar back to life. He understood the fundamental physics of combustion better than most people understand their own breathing. But this FXR was breaking all his rules. But as the massive Jim Mercer hit the kill switch on his handlebars and stepped heavily off his idling chopper, Rusty's usually tanned and weathered face went completely pale. All the confidence of a master mechanic seemed to drain right out of his boots, leaving him looking like a man standing on the trap door of a gallows. He dropped the dirty rag onto his workbench and wiped his sweating palms on his heavy canvas overalls. He had been dreading this specific conversation all week, hoping he would figure out the mechanical puzzle before Jim ever arrived. Jim did not bother with pleasantries or handshakes. He walked straight up to the open garage door, his heavy boots crunching on the loose gravel, and stared intensely at the head mechanic. "Tell me she is breathing, Rusty," Jim demanded. His voice was a low, dangerous gravelly rumble that barely carried over the sharp pinging and ticking of 30 cooling exhaust pipes in the baking parking lot. The words hung in the muggy afternoon air, carrying the weight of a direct order rather than a simple question. Jim fully expected to hear good news today. Rusty swallowed hard, a painful dry gulp that felt like he was trying to swallow a handful of sand. He broke eye contact for just a split second, tossing his dirty red shop rag onto a nearby wooden workbench cluttered with wrenches and empty coffee cups. He needed a moment to gather his courage, knowing that the words he was about to speak could potentially ruin his entire livelihood. You could see the sheer exhaustion radiating off his sloping shoulders, the physical toll of spending 2 straight weeks fighting a losing battle against a hunk of metal. Slowly, Rusty turned his head and looked past the giant enforcer, staring mournfully at the silent motorcycle strapped to the back of the heavy flatbed truck. Then, taking a deep breath, he looked right back into Jim Mercer's cold, steely eyes. "Jim, I am going to shoot you completely straight here. Right now, because I deeply respect you, and I respect this motorcycle club." Rusty's voice was shaking slightly, but he forced himself to stand his ground. He knew that lying to a man like Jim was a fantastic way to get your shop burned to the foundation. Rusty pointed a grease-stained finger toward the back of the dark shop. I have had 3 of my absolute best mechanics working around the clock on that specific FXR for 2 straight weeks. We have barely slept. We completely tore down and rebuilt the entire carburetor from scratch, soaking every jet and replacing every single gasket until it was cleaner than a hospital operating room. He was talking fast now, desperate to lay out the sheer amount of specialized labor they had poured into the dead machine. He needed Jim to understand the massive effort. He did not stop there, counting the repairs off on his calloused fingers. We went ahead and swapped out the entire ignition system for brand new parts. When that did not work, we completely ripped out the 40-year-old wiring harness, tracing every single copper wire by hand. We installed a fresh stator, put in a brand new rotor, and upgraded the ignition coil to make sure it was getting maximum juice. Rusty was essentially describing a complete resurrection of the electrical system, an incredibly expensive process that usually fixes any vintage motorcycle. Rusty kept pushing his case, leaning forward with his hands raised pleadingly. We even went as far as tearing down the entire top end of the engine to physically check the cylinder compression. We measured the rings, checked the valve seating, and hooked up the gauges. The compression is absolutely perfect, Jim. It holds pressure like it just rolled right off the factory assembly line back in Milwaukee. He was practically begging the giant biker to see the logic of the situation, listing off procedures that proved the mechanical integrity was flawless. Now you and I have all hit that incredibly frustrating wall where logic just completely stops working, right? Rusty hit that wall hard. Mathematically, scientifically, by every known law of modern mechanics, that engine should absolutely start and run flawlessly. Rusty insisted, his voice rising in desperation. But Jim Mercer did not even blink. He took a heavy step forward, closing the distance between them. I do not want a damn science lesson from you, Jim interrupted sharply, cutting off the mechanic's frantic rambling with a tone like cracking ice. As Jim took that aggressive step forward into the garage, the tension spiked dangerously. The half-dozen hardcore bikers standing right behind him instantly mirrored his movement, shifting their weight and moving as one cohesive, intimidating unit. They planted their heavy boots on the concrete and crossed their thickly tattooed arms over their leather vests. The message was incredibly clear, without a single word being spoken. They were not here to debate shop hours or mechanical theory. They were a unified wall of muscle demanding immediate results. Jim leaned down just an inch, casting a massive shadow over the panicked shop owner. I do not care about your new parts. I want to hear Dutch's bike turn over right now, the enforcer demanded, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal roof. Rusty physically shrank back, all his mechanical pride vanishing in an instant. It will not turn over, Rusty finally admitted, his voice cracking slightly with a mix of absolute exhaustion and sheer terror. He was formally surrendering to the dead machine, completely unable to deliver the miracle they demanded. Rusty rubbed his face, trying to explain the unexplainable. Every single time we hit the electric starter, the engine cranks over strongly, but it absolutely will not catch a spark to run. It just spins and spins. And if we bypass the electrics and try to manually kickstart the pedal, the engine violently kicks back. It backfired so hard yesterday that the pedal snapped upward and nearly shattered my young apprentice's shin bone into powder. The machine was actively fighting back, behaving more like a trapped, angry animal than a piece of machinery. The head mechanic shook his head, looking completely lost as he pointed helplessly at the bike on the truck. And then there is the phantom electrical drain. Jim, I swear to you, it makes absolutely no logical sense whatsoever. It defies everything I have learned in 30 years of building custom motorcycles. Rusty was a man who lived his entire life based on rules, physics, and wiring diagrams. And this cursed 1986 Harley was logging in the face of all his hard-earned knowledge. He was truly at the end of his rope, completely out of ideas. Rusty threw his hands up in genuine defeat. You can put a brand new, fully charged, heavy-duty battery straight into the tray and within 10 flat minutes, something invisible sucks the power absolutely bone dry. Just dead flat. There has to be some kind of massive electrical short buried somewhere deep down inside the main engine, case that we simply cannot locate, no matter how deeply we tear into the wiring. It was like the dark iron of the motorcycle was actively drinking the electricity, pulling power into an endless void that no tool could measure. Rusty dropped his hands, offering the ultimate humiliating confession for a master builder. "I am truly sorry, Jim. We gave up. We hit our absolute limit." Honestly, you need to hire an exorcist to look at this thing, not a motorcycle mechanic. As soon as those deeply fateful words left his mouth, a heavy, suffocating blanket of silence fell instantly over the entire garage. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The buzzing of a fluorescent light bulb overhead suddenly sounded as loud as a chainsaw in the terrible, agonizing quiet of the standoff. The stagnant summer air trapped inside the open gauge smelled incredibly thick, carrying the sharp chemical tang of raw gasoline mixed with the sour stench of nervous sweat. But beneath those familiar shop odors, there was something much darker brewing in the heat. It smelled exactly like impending, unavoidable violence. The kind of raw tension that makes the tiny hairs on the back of your neck stand straight up, warning your brain that someone is about to throw a punch that will shatter bones and end careers. The situation was on a razor-thin edge. Slowly, deliberately, Jim Mercer stepped fully out of the bright sunlight and crossed the threshold directly into the dim, oily garage. Each step he took landed with a terrifying, rhythmic thud, his heavy leather boots echoing sharply against the grease-stained concrete floor. He did not yell. He did not swing his fists. The deliberate, measured slowness of his walk was actually 10 times more intimidating than if he had come in screaming. He moved like a predator that had already successfully cornered its prey and was in absolutely no rush to finish the job. He bypassed Rusty completely and walked directly over to the flatbed truck holding the dead FXR. Jim reached out and gently rested his massive, heavily scarred hand squarely on the faded black leather seat. If you looked closely, you could see that the worn leather still bore the permanent physical imprint of his beloved, deceased brother. The way Jim touched that motorcycle was surprisingly tender, completely at odds with his terrifying reputation. For a brief, haunting moment, he was not an enforcer at all. He was just a deeply grieving friend. "Dutch built this entire club from the ground up," Jim whispered softly to the dark metal. But in the absolute, pin-drop dead silence of the crowded shop, every single man heard those words loud and clear. Jim kept his massive hand pressed firmly to the worn leather. "He was the man who reached down and personally pulled me out of the gutter back in 1994, when nobody else gave a damn if I lived or died." The enforcer was speaking raw truth now, exposing the deep, unbreakable bond of loyalty that drove this desperate quest for a miracle. Jim's voice slowly gathered its heavy, rumbling power once again. "This specific motorcycle leads the massive memorial run down the coast this coming Saturday morning. That is not a request, that is a fact. If this engine does not fire up and take its rightful place at the absolute front of the pack, it is a massive sign of disrespect to Dutch's incredible legacy. And I will absolutely not allow my brother to be disrespected in front of 1,000 riders." The memorial was a sacred event, and failing to deliver the bike was an unforgivable sin. Having made his peace with the motorcycle, Jim Mercer slowly turned his massive frame around to face the terrified mechanic once again. That brief, fleeting moment of vulnerability was completely gone. The deep, heavy sorrow that had been swimming in his dark eyes just a moment before had suddenly hardened into something entirely cold, flat, and incredibly dangerous. He stared at Rusty with the emotionless calculation of an executioner stepping up to the chopping block, ready to deliver the final verdict on the mechanic's massive failure. Jim crossed his thick arms, the leather of his cut creaking loudly in the quiet room. "I handed you $5,000 in cold, hard cash right up front, Rusty. I looked you in the eye, and I deeply trusted you to handle club business with the respect it deserved. That was the absolute worst thing Jim could possibly say in this situation. In the harsh, uncompromising world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, breaking a man's trust was a far greater offense than simply failing to fix a broken engine. Rusty had promised a result, and he had completely failed. Jim tilted his heavy head to the side, his voice dropping into a deadly, even tone. If you are standing here telling my brothers and me that the great famous Apex Ironworks is completely giving up on a simple 40-year-old piece of American steel, then maybe we have a serious problem. Maybe a shop that takes $5,000 and throws their hands in the air simply does not deserve to keep its rolling doors open to the public anymore. The terrifying implication hung heavily in the stale air, a clear promise that failure meant total destruction. Upon hearing that incredibly clear threat to his livelihood and his safety, Rusty instinctively took a quick, stumbling step backward away from the massive biker. He immediately raised both of his grease-stained hands up to his chest in a universal, desperate gesture of surrender and defense. His heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew exactly what these men were capable of when they felt they had been wronged, and he realized he was standing far too close to the blast zone of a bomb that was just seconds away from fully detonating. Jim, please, you have to listen to reason here. We genuinely tried absolutely everything in the book. It is a completely dead machine. Rusty pleaded, practically begging for mercy, but Jim Mercer simply stared right through him like he was made of glass. I will give you until noon on Friday, Jim said flatly, his deep voice completely devoid of any human emotion whatsoever. He was not negotiating or asking for a favor. He was issuing a final, unbreakable deadline that carried the heavy weight of an absolute death sentence for the famous custom garage. Jim pointed a massive, heavily ringed finger straight at the mechanic's chest. If I come back here on Friday afternoon, and you hit that starter button and that specific engine does not immediately fire up and idle perfectly, I am taking my brother's motorcycle out of your shop. The words were slow and painfully deliberate, making absolutely sure that every single syllable carved itself deeply into Rusty's terrified brain. Jim was setting the final trap, leaving the exhausted mechanic with absolutely nowhere left to hide from the massive consequences. Stick with me here because this is where the situation gets truly heavy. Jim leaned in closer and delivered the final blow. And then, after I load up the bike, I am taking my $5,000 back from you, one way or another. That deeply chilling threat hung completely suspended in the hot summer air, absolute and truly terrifying. Jim did not need to scream or wave a weapon around to make his terrifying point perfectly clear. The quiet, deadly promise of extreme violence echoed far louder than any shouting match ever could have in that garage. Poor Rusty knew exactly, down to the last broken bone, what the phrase "one way or another" meant when it came from a Hells Angels enforcer. It meant shattered kneecaps, a burned-out building, and a trip to the intensive care unit. He had a loving wife sitting at home, a massive mortgage payment due on the first of the month, and a booming custom motorcycle business that he had literally bled sweat and cried over for 3 decades to build. And now he was staring down the barrel of losing absolutely all of it over a stubborn electrical gremlin. Slowly, Rusty turned his terrified eyes away from Jim and looked back at the 1986 motorcycle sitting on the truck. It just sat there like a dark, immovable monolith of cold iron and endless frustration. The head mechanic suddenly felt entirely, overwhelmingly helpless. All his trophies, all his magazine covers, all his decades of specialized knowledge meant absolutely nothing in the face of this cursed machine. He was completely trapped in a nightmare, waiting for the clock to run out and the heavy boots to come kicking down his shop doors. Just when it seemed like all hope had vanished into thin air, a voice suddenly broke the silence. "You are checking the wrong timing marks." The voice was incredibly small and high-pitched, barely louder than a nervous whisper echoing off the metal tools. But against all odds, those 7 simple words cut cleanly through the heavy, suffocating tension of the crowded garage, like a sharply honed razor blade slicing through thick leather. It was so completely unexpected that it felt like a ghost had just spoken up from the shadowy depths of the workbench. Jim Mercer violently snapped his massive head around, his thick beard whipping across his leather vest as he tried to locate the source of the interruption. His cold, dangerous stare swept across the cluttered floor. Rusty just stood there, entirely frozen, blinking his tired eyes in absolute shock, unable to process what was happening. Someone had just dared to interrupt a notorious enforcé handing out a violent ultimatum, which was basically the equivalent of poking a sleeping grizzly bear with a sharp stick and waiting to see what happens next. Behind their massive leader, the half-dozen imposing members of the Hells Angels all turned in perfect, terrifying unison. Their combat boots scuffed loudly against the concrete as they pivoted to face the dark corner of the room. Out of pure, hardened street instinct, every single one of their heavily tattooed hands dropped quickly down toward their heavy leather belts, reaching for heavy flashlights or brass knuckles. They were fully prepared for a deadly ambush, scanning the dim lighting for a rival club or a foolish mechanic armed with a heavy wrench. But there was no rival biker gang hiding in the back room, and there was no angry mechanic wielding a tire iron. Standing completely still in the dusty, shadowy corner of the deep garage, gripping a heavy wooden push broom that was easily twice his own height, was just a little boy. He was standing near the touring stacks of spare motorcycle tires, looking absolutely tiny compared to the massive leather-clad giants who were currently staring him down. He had just inserted himself directly into the most dangerous conversation in the entire city of Oakland. The kid standing there holding the massive broom honestly could not have been more than 8 years old. He was incredibly, almost painfully thin, looking like a strong gust of wind could knock him completely over. He was wearing a deeply faded, oversized gray cotton-on t-shirt that draped loosely off his narrow, bony shoulders like a tent. Covering his scrawny legs were a pair of cheap blue jeans, heavily patched with mismatched fabric at both knees to cover up the holes from crawling around on the dirty concrete floors. He looked completely out of place. Despite his tiny size, he looked like he belonged in a garage. His young, pale face was heavily smudged with thick, dark engine grease, smeared across his cheeks and forehead like tribal war paint. His small hands were completely black with oily grime from cleaning up around the heavy machinery. You could tell just by looking at his filthy fingernails that he had spent the entire morning sweeping up metal shavings, organizing dropped bolts, and wiping down oily drip pans while trying his absolute best to stay completely out of the older mechanic's way. But here is the remarkable thing about this skinny kid. Despite the terrifying situation, his bright, piercing blue eyes stared directly, unblinkingly, right into the heavily scarred face of the massive Hells Angels enforcer. He was not crying, and he was not shaking in his worn-out sneakers. He was standing his ground with a bizarre, completely unnatural calm for a child his age. The small, brave kid with the oversized shirt and the heavy broom was Leo. And Leo was about to completely change the entire course of this tense, disastrous afternoon. Rusty finally found his voice, and sheer terror made it loud and incredibly harsh.
"Leo, shut your mouth right now and get straight back to sweeping the floors!"
The head mechanic barked loudly, his internal panic spiking through the absolute roof. He waved his heavy arms wildly, desperately trying to wave the tiny boy back into the safe, protective shadows of the parts room. The very last thing Rusty wanted was for this innocent kid to get caught in the dangerous crossfire of a deeply unstable outlaw motorcycle gang demanding impossible miracles. The absolutely last thing the exhausted shop owner needed right now was a smart-mouthed street kid boldly provoking a notoriously violent motorcycle club when tensions were already completely maxed out. How any wrong word could literally spark a riot. But surprisingly little, Leo did not even flinch at the mechanic's angry shouting. He did not drop his heavy broom, and he did not turn around and run away crying like any normal 8-year-old child definitely would have. He just kept his bright blue eyes locked securely onto the giant biker standing in the bay. You and I both know what usually happens when a kid interrupts angry adults. But Leo was different. He gripped the thick wooden handle of his push broom even tighter, his little knuckles turning completely white. Then he bravely took a deliberate step straight out of the protective shadows, walking right into the dangerous center of the violent standoff. Jim Mercer, the terrifying enforcer who regularly made grown men weep, slowly lowered his massive head and stared down in total disbelief at this scrawny, grease-covered child standing near his boots. For a long, quiet moment, the sheer incredible absurdity of the bizarre situation completely baffled the hardened biker. Here he was, threatening to violently shut down the most famous custom motorcycle garage in the Bay Area, only to be bravely interrupted by a first grader holding a broomstick. Jim slowly pointed a massive, scarred finger down at the tiny boy.
Who the hell is this kid?
Jim demanded loudly, snapping his intense gaze right back to the panicked shop owner, demanding an immediate explanation for this ridiculous, unexpected delay.
He is absolutely nobody, Jim, I swear,
Rusty said incredibly quickly, his words stumbling over each other in a desperate rush to de-escalate the dangerous tension in the room. The terrific head mechanic practically sprinted forward across the dirty concrete floor, urgently reaching out to grab little Leo by his scrawny, oversized sleeve. Rusty just wanted to physically drag the boy safely away from the towering, leather-clad giants before someone completely lost their temper and decided to teach the disrespectful child a very harsh, unforgettable lesson. Rusty positioned his body firmly between the massive enforcer and the tiny kid babbling nervously to explain the boy's presence. His dad was a really good guy who used to rent a small repair bay way in the back of the shop before he suddenly passed away last year. It was a tragic, all too common story in the local garage scene. A talented backyard mechanic dies too young, leaving his broken family completely behind to pick up the messy pieces, constantly hanging around the loud shops, hoping to hold on to the lingering oily memories of a lost father. Rusty kept pleading his frantic case to the silent bikers. The kid's mom is currently working 3 separate diner jobs just to keep a basic roof over their heads, so I let him come down here after school to sweep up the metal shavings for a few extra bucks and a hot meal at the diner next door. I promise you, Jim, he is just a little kid repeating things he heard on television. He absolutely does not know what he is talking about regarding this massive motorcycle. Rusty was doing everything in his power to protect the boy from his own brave mouth. Rusty tugged forcefully on the boy's shirt.
Come on, right now, Leo. Get straight into the back room and stay there,
the mechanic ordered, his voice cracking with pure stress. But instead of crying or complying, little Leo planted his feet firmly and yanked his thin arm completely out of Rusty's desperate grasp with truly surprising sudden strength. The skinny kid did not even bother looking up at the panicked mechanic. He kept his bright blue eyes locked directly onto the giant biker, fully prepared to defend his bold claim about the cursed machine. Picture this. You and I are standing in the grease-stained corner of a sweltering motorcycle shop, watching something that absolutely should not be happening. A little boy practically swallowing his own terror, keeping his unblinking eyes locked dead onto Jim Mercer. Now Jim is a mountain of a man wearing weathered Hell's Angels leather, a guy who casts a shadow long enough to freeze blood. But this kid simply does not look away. He holds his ground in the heavy, oil-scented air, staring up at a man most grown adults would sprint away from.
I know what I'm talking about,
little Leo said, and his voice was miraculously steady for an 8-year-old facing down a man who had done hard time in a federal penitentiary. The whole shop seemed to hold its collective breath. Leo pointed a finger toward the mechanics huddled in the background.
Mr. Rusty and his guys over there, they are plugging the motorcycle into diagnostic computers, the boy explained, his tone carrying the calm authority of an old wrench who had seen it all.
He wasn't bragging. He was just stating a cold, hard fact about their methods. They are standing around reading the standard factory service manuals for a 1986 Evolution motor. Leo continued, his small voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the garage. He watched the mechanics flip through crisp, clean pages, looking for answers that were never going to be printed in any official book. The boy knew that those diagrams and torque specs were entirely useless for the monster sitting on the lift. He looked back at the giant biker, his tiny frame dwarfed by the massive machines surrounding him,
entirely confident in what he was seeing. "But that bike ain't standard," Leo declared, delivering the final verdict with absolute certainty. The tension in the room snapped when one of the younger angels, a freshly patched prospect named Bobby, let out a harsh, barking laugh that bounced off the concrete floor. Bobby shook his head, highly amused by the sheer audacity of this filthy street kid trying to school them on mechanics. "Listen to the rugrat," Bobby scoffed, stepping forward with a smirk plastered across his face, entirely unaware of the line he was about to cross in front of his chapter president. "Kid, why do not you go play with your Hot Wheels somewhere else?" Bobby sneered, crossing his arms and puffing out his chest to look tough for the older guys. "Grown men are talking here, and we do not need a toddler telling us how to build a chopper." The young prospect thought he was being clever, thought he was putting a disrespectful kid firmly back in his place. He had no idea that the air in the garage had just dropped 10 degrees, or that the veteran riders standing behind him were suddenly shifting their weight, waiting to see exactly how their leader would react to the outburst. Jim Mercer did not even turn his head. He simply raised a single massive hand in the air, a quiet gesture that silenced Bobby instantly. The prospect's smirk vanished like a blown-out candle, leaving nothing but nervous silence in its wake. Jim lowered his hand, his rugged face turning hard and unreadable. His dark eyes narrowed into thin slits as he looked slowly from the frail little boy over to the cursed black motorcycle sitting on the center stand, and then right back to the boy. Something in Jim's mind was clicking together an old memory trying to surface. "What did you just say, kid?" Jim asked, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous gravel that demanded total honesty. He was not angry, but he was entirely focused, cutting through all the background noise of the busy shop. Leo did not flinch or back away from the question. Instead, he stepped right up to the chrome beast and pointed a grimy, grease-stained finger directly at the heavy timing cover bolted to the right side of the engine block. The kid moved with a kind of casual confidence that only comes from knowing exactly how a piece of machinery breathes. They timed the ignition based on the factory marks for an Evo motor, but that is a trap, Leo explained, looking straight into Jim's weathered face. "My dad told me all about this specific bike." The boy spoke of his father with a quiet reverence, treating the man's words like sacred mechanical gospel. He was spelling out a secret that had completely baffled the professional mechanics who had been scratching their heads for days. To them, the engine was just a stubborn hunk of aluminum. But to Leo, it was a carefully constructed puzzle meant to trick the unwary. "He always said Mr. Dutch was an absolute madman when it came to building engines." Leo continued, dropping the name with innocent precision. The moment those words hit the air, Jim Mercer froze. You could actually see the massive biker's chest stop moving. His breath hitched slightly at the sudden, unexpected mention of his late, deeply mourned friend. Hearing Dutch's name coming from the mouth of a hungry little street kid was like catching a ghost in the headlights. The atmosphere here in the garage shifted from tense to something heavy, solemn, and thickly nostalgic. "Go on," Jim commanded, softly, the rough edge completely gone from his voice now. "My dad said Mr. Dutch totally blew the bottom end out of this motor during a desert race down in Reno back in 1992. Leo explained, stepping even closer to the dangerous machine. The boy was totally locked in, now reciting the history like a master storyteller recounting a legendary battle. He ran his eyes over the metal cases, seeing past the polished exterior, straight down to the chaotic, violent damage that had ripped the heart out of the bike decades before he was even born. Leo reached out with an almost sacred gentleness, tracing his small, dirty fingers directly over the brushed aluminum of the cam cover. It was a gesture of profound respect, the way an artist might touch a priceless sculpture. You could tell just by looking at him that he wasn't just touching cold metal. He was feeling for the soul of the machine, reading the physical scars left behind by a brilliant, crazy builder. In that sweltering garage, surrounded by towering, dangerous outlaws, the boy looked entirely at peace, as long as his hands were resting on the engine. He did not have the kind of money required to buy brand-new factory replacement parts, the boy stated, painting a picture of a desperate builder with empty pockets and a blown-up race bike. The mechanics listening in the background nodded supply at that universal truth. Sometimes, when a GUI is totally broke and his primary ride goes up in smoke, he has to get creative.
Leo understood that kind of poverty all too well. The kind where you have to make do with whatever broken junk is laying around the yard just to keep moving forward. It was a language he spoke fluently, so instead of buying new, he gutted a wrecked 1978 shovelhead and personally machined the older cam gear to perfectly fit inside this newer case. Leo explained, his words ringing out like a judge reading a final verdict. Because of that crazy swap, the timing marks stamped on the internal flywheels are off by exactly 12 degrees. The veteran mechanic standing by the toolboxes physically recoiled, instantly understanding the sheer terrifying brilliance of what the kid was describing. It was a nightmare hybrid, a total freak of mechanical nature. If you try to set the timing and fire it up relying on the standard factory mark, the spark plug detonates while the intake valve is still hanging wide open, Leo said, mapping out the invisible violence happening inside the cylinders. It was a recipe for absolute disaster. Setting off a highly compressed fuel charge with an open valve sends a massive shockwave of explosive pressure violently backward through the intake system. It was not just a simple tuning error. It was a mechanical booby trap designed to ruthlessly punish anyone who did not know the secret history. That is exactly why it violently kicks back through the starter and tries to break your leg. Leo finished, staring at the heavy kickstart pedal. Now stick with me here, because this is where the dynamic in the room completely flips. The busy, noisy garage went entirely dead silent. You could hear a pin drop onto the grease-stained concrete. The shop owner, Rusty, stood absolutely frozen in his tracks, his jaw hanging slightly open as the profound embarrassment washed over him. A dirty street kid had just diagnosed in 2 minutes what his seasoned team could not figure out in a week. The greasy mechanics lurking in the back shadows who had been quietly eavesdropping on the whole confrontation slowly stepped out from behind their towering red toolboxes. They looked like a pack of scolded dogs wiping black grease from their hands with old rags, entirely speechless. Jim Mercer did not even glance at them. He kept his heavy gaze locked firmly on the 8-year-old boy processing the incredible revelation. "And what about the battery drain issue?" Jim asked, throwing another impossible puzzle at the kid to see if the brilliant streak would hold up. Jim asked the question with a voice that was suddenly very quiet, completely devoid of the aggressive, thundering anger he had brought into the shop earlier that morning. He was no longer threatening them. He was genuinely seeking answers from the only person making any sense. Leo did not miss a single beat. He looked right back, up at the towering gang president, and gave a slight, knowing shake of his small head. "It is not an electrical short," Leo said, simply dismissing the amateur diagnosis that Rusty's professional team had been chasing in circles for days on end. "It is a hidden kill switch." Leo revealed a faint trace of a smile touching his dirty face. "Think about that for a second. The genius of it is staggering. My dad said Mr. Dutch was intensely paranoid about strangers trying to steal his motorcycle," the boy continued, illuminating the mindset of a man who built machines to defend themselves. Dutch had poured his literal blood sweat and completely empty bank accounts into building this wicked machine, and he was not about to let some random thief hotwire it and ride off into the California sunset while he was asleep. So he custom-wired a heavily concealed secondary ignition bypass directly into the steel frame, tucking it high up underneath the hollow cavity of the gas tank, Leo explained, tracing the invisible path of the wiring harness through the air with his finger. It was a brilliant, deeply devious piece of electrical engineering. He took the standard starting circuit and fundamentally broke it, routing the vital flow of electricity through a shadowy detour that no common criminal would ever think to look for while sweating over a stolen machine in a dark alleyway. If you do not physically reach under there and toggle a tiny hidden switch beneath the left side fat bob tank right before you turn the main ignition key, the starting circuit simply stays wide open, Leo said, breaking down the mechanical witchcraft piece by piece. He mimed reaching under the heavy curves of the fuel tank, showing them exactly where the secret button was buried in the dark. Without that specific sequence, turning the key was worse than useless. It was a deliberate trap set by a deeply paranoid mechanical genius to punish anyone who touched his property. It bypasses the starter entirely, violently grounding the battery directly to the raw metal frame. It bleeds a brand new battery totally dry in 10 minutes flat, Leo concluded, crossing his small arms like a professor wrapping up a heavy lecture. Jim Mercer just stood there, completely motionless, staring deeply into the eyes of the boy. The heavy silence stretched out as the words sank in. Jim felt the sudden dizzying rush of old memories washing over him, pulling his mind away from the dusty Oakland garage and dragging him backwards through time to a very different life. Jim Mercer remembered 1992 with a vivid, painful clarity. It was a wild, reckless era in his life, a time when the highway seemed completely endless, and the roaring engines were the only religion he needed. It was before the gray hairs, before the federal prison time, and before the deep aches settled permanently into his bones. Back then, the world was loud, fast, and entirely untamed. The smell of cheap beer, burning rubber, and high-octane racing fuel was permanently etched into his brain, a sensory ghost from a much younger, much more dangerous decade. He remembered the scorching heat of Reno. He clearly remembered his best friend Dutch laughing like an absolute maniac in the dusty gravel of a cheap motel parking lot. Dutch was covered from head to toe in black motor oil, wiping his filthy hands on his jeans, while excitedly bragging about a monstrous Frankenstein engine he was secretly building entirely from scratch. Jim could almost hear Dutch's booming voice echoing off the neon signs, swearing up and down that he was going to build a terrifying machine that would smoke absolutely every other rider out on the asphalt. Jim slowly pulled himself out of the memory, blinking away the harsh desert sun of the past, to focus on the small, skinny boy standing in front of him. The giant biker leaned forward, suddenly desperate to connect the final dot in this crazy puzzle. "What was your dad's name, kid?" Jim asked softly, his voice trembling just a fraction of an inch. It was a question asked not out of anger, but out of a deep, aching hope. He needed to know the identity of the man who had passed down these sacred secrets, the man who had understood his dead best friend's twisted brilliance. "Arthur," Leo replied quietly, and for the very first time since the confrontation began, the tough little kid finally broke eye contact. His gaze dropped sadly down to the grease-stained concrete floor as the heavy weight of grief settled onto his narrow shoulders. "Arthur Hayes," the boy whispered. Jim let out a slow, heavy exhale that seemed to empty his massive lungs completely. He reached up with a scarred hand and slowly removed his dark sunglasses, revealing eyes that were suddenly swimming with a profound mixture of shock, sorrow, and deep, unspoken recognition. "Artie Hayes," Jim muttered quietly to himself, rolling the familiar name around in his mouth like a sip of incredibly fine-aged whiskey. The sheer impossible coincidence of it all hit him squarely in the chest. Of all the garages in all the cities in California, he had managed to walk into the exact one where Artie's boy was sweeping the floors. Jim turned away from the kid and looked back at the other towering Hells Angels standing behind him. The hardened bikers were watching their president closely, recognizing the heavy emotional shift completely washing over his face. Artie Hayes was the absolute only independent wrench that Dutch ever trusted outside of our club. Jim explained to his brothers, his voice thick with deep respect. The guy was a genuine wizard with a wrench, could make a pile of scrap metal sing a beautiful song. A dark shadow crossed Jim's eyes as he recalled the tragic end of the brilliant mechanic's story. "He died of aggressive lung cancer about 2 years ago," Jim added somberly, bowing his head for a brief, respectful moment. Then, with the history lesson complete, Jim turned his heavy, terrifying gaze right back to Rusty. "Rusty, did you even bother to crack the case and check for a Southall-head cam gear before you started throwing my money around?" Jim demanded, his voice suddenly sharp and cracking like a leather bullwhip. The garage owner physically recoiled from the harsh question. Rusty swallowed hard, a massive lump of pure terror forming thick in his throat. Cold, oily sweat was rapidly beating up along his receding hairline. He had been thoroughly exposed, completely humiliated by an 8-year-old boy in front of the most dangerous, unforgiving motorcycle club president on the entire West Coast. "Jim, come on now. You absolutely cannot be serious about this," Rusty stammered, raising his hands in a frantic, defensive gesture. The shop owner was practically begging the biker to see reason, clinging desperately to his professional pride. "You simply cannot just mix old shovelhead gears and newer Evolution bottom-end parts together in the same block like that." Rusty was panicking, falling back on his textbook knowledge, because it was the only defense he had left against the undeniable truth that a dirty little street urchin had completely outsmarted his entire operation. The machining tolerances on those specific components are entirely different. It is an absolute mechanical nightmare waiting to happen. Rusty pleaded, trying to sound like the voice of sanity. But Jim Mercer was completely out of patience. "You and I both know that when a man like Jim asks a simple yes or no question, he does not want a technical lecture." "Did you actually check it?" Jim roared, his thunderous voice exploding through the shop and echoing violently off the corrugated metal roof. The sheer volume rattled the wrenches right where they sat inside the metal toolboxes. "No," Rusty finally admitted, his voice shrinking down to a pathetic, defeated whisper. He hung his head, unable to meet the gang president's furious stare. "We just followed the standard procedures. We went strictly by the factory book." Jim snorted in pure disgust. Relying on a standard manual to fix a custom-built outlaw motorcycle was a total fool's errand, and Rusty knew it. With the incompetent garage owner thoroughly crushed, Jim slowly turned his massive shoulders and looked back down at the skinny, quietly observant 8-year-old boy still standing by the lift. Jim took a long, hard look at the reality of Leo's desperate situation. The kid was incredibly dirty, covered in dark smudges of grease that highlighted just how terribly underfed he really was. His collarbone stuck out sharply against his oversized faded t-shirt. Down at the floor, he was wearing a pair of ragged sneakers with gaping holes right through the toes, exposing his socks to the dangerous shop environment. He was a forgotten child, a heavy casualty of the harsh, unforgiving streets, scraping by on whatever leftover crumbs the adults around him decided to drop. Yet underneath all that grime and obvious poverty, Jim looked deep into Leo's bright, fiercely intelligent eyes. Right there, shining in the dark, the biker clearly saw the exact same untamed spark of pure mechanical genius that the boy's legendary father used to possess. It was a rare, beautiful inheritance, passed down entirely in blood and grease instead of money. Jim crouched down slightly to put himself closer to the boy's level, shifting his entire posture from intimidating to intensely collaborative. "Do you honestly think you can fix it, kid?" Jim asked, dead serious. "Let's pause right here because you can actually feel the panic seizing the shop owner's chest." Rusty immediately stepped forward, waving his hands in a totally frantic, desperate motion. "Jim, please, I am begging you to be reasonable here," Rusty pleaded, his voice cracking loudly under the immense stress. "Look at him. He is literally 8 years old." To Rusty, giving control of a highly dangerous, incredibly expensive machine to a scrawny child was absolute, undeniable madness. It was professional suicide, and he was desperately trying to stop the impending disaster. He physically does not have the upper body strength required to properly torque down a heavy cylinder head, let alone the complicated skills needed to completely retime a highly customized V-twin racing engine. Rusty argued, completely losing his cool. He was listing off the physical realities of heavy mechanical work, hoping against hope that logic would somehow pierce through the giant biker's crazy decision. It takes serious muscle to wrestle those iron components into submission, and the kid looked like a stiff breeze could blow him right over a toolbox. If he gets the timing chain even one single tooth off and slightly messes up the delicate valve clearance, the rising piston is going to violently smash right into them. Rusty warned, painting a terrifying picture of total, catastrophic failure. That impact will instantly turn the entire top end of that motor into a flying metal grenade. He was completely right about the devastating consequences, of course. A high-compression engine tearing itself to pieces at top speed is a deeply lethal event, scattering burning hot shrapnel like a bomb going off in a crowded room. "I asked the boy," Jim said with a totally brutal, icy coldness, never once taking his intense, dark eyes off of little Leo. The biker's absolute dismissal of the shop owner hung heavily in the suffocating air. Hearing his cue, Leo slowly looked up at the towering giant, refusing to shrink back. "I cannot lift those really heavy torque wrenches myself, sir," the brave 8-year-old openly admitted, his voice ringing with a powerful, disarming honesty. "Mr. Rusty is completely right about the physical part of the job. I simply do not have the muscle for it. But if you let me tell them exactly what they need to do, if you let me carefully guide their adult hands, step by step, I promise you, I can absolutely make this beast run," Leo declared, his small chin lifted with fierce, undeniable determination. It was a brilliant, highly unusual compromise, relying on his massive brain to pilot their brawn. Jim Mercer stared at the kid for a long, agonizingly silent moment, weighing the enormous risk against his deep faith in Artie's bloodline. Slowly, deliberately, the massive outlaw nodded his head in total agreement. Moving with deliberate menace, Jim finally turned away from the boy and locked his terrifying focus back onto the sweating shop owner. He raised a thick, heavily scarred finger and pointed it directly at the center of Rusty's chest like a loaded gun. "Do you hear that clearly, Rusty?" Jim growled his deep voice, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. "As of right this very second, this dirty little 8-year-old boy is your official new shop foreman. He is entirely in charge of my motorcycle, and you are going to listen to his every single word. From here on out, you and your useless mechanics are nothing more than his hands," Jim ordered, completely stripping away the crew's professional pride in one brutal sentence. "You are going to do exactly what he tells you to do, right when he tells you to do it. Every single heavy bolt you turn, every tangled wire you connect, and every precise timing degree you set, it all comes directly from his mouth first." It was the ultimate crushing humiliation for a team of grown men totally forced to surrender their shop to a scrawny child who barely reached their waists. Rusty looked absolutely horrified, staring back at the giant biker, as if Jim had suddenly sprouted a second head. All the blood completely rushed out of the shop owner's face, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost under the buzzing fluorescent lights. He desperately opened his mouth, trying to find some kind of argument, some magical combination of words that would wake them all up from this bizarre, twisted nightmare. Handing over command of a highly volatile custom engine build to an uneducated street kid went against every rule he had ever learned in his entire life. "Jim, please listen. If this reckless kid violently destroys Dutch's motor, if he ruins the whole block, it is going to fall directly on me," Rusty stammered out. "It is on him, and it is on me," Jim interrupted loudly, cutting the coward off at the knees. Jim leaned forward, lowering his voice into a chilling promise. "But mark my words carefully. If I walk back in here tomorrow at noon, and this motorcycle is not roaring loud enough to shake the dust off the ceiling, I am shutting this entire garage down permanently. You will never turn another wrench in this town." Leaving the devastating threat hanging heavily in the quiet room, Jim Mercer slowly turned his attention away from the terrified shop owner. Moving with a surprising deliberate grace for a man of his incredible size, the giant biker reached a massive hand deeply inside his weathered, patch-covered leather vest. The seasoned mechanics flinched instinctively, bracing themselves, as if the terrifying outlaw might pull out a heavy revolver to finish making his violent point. Instead, Jim's fingers dug into an inner pocket, searching for something entirely different to leave behind. Jim pulled out a perfectly crisp, freshly printed $100 bill from his leather pocket. He stepped forward and firmly shoved the green paper directly into Leo's tiny, greasy hand, closing the boy's small fingers securely around the massive sum of cash. "Go take that money and buy yourself a huge, thick steak tonight, kid. Jim said, his tone softening back into that strange, fatherly gruffness. It was more money than the hungry boy had ever held at one time in his entire life. An absolute fortune, handed over by the most dangerous man in the city. You are going to need absolutely all of your physical energy for what comes next. Jim advised, giving the boy a singular heavy nod of absolute confidence. You arrive back here and start turning wrenches on the Widowmaker right at dawn tomorrow. Do not be late. Giving the fearsome, cursed motorcycle its proper, terrifying title added a profound weight to the fast-approaching deadline. The giant biker was officially passing the heavy torch of his dead best friend's legacy directly into the frail, dirt-covered hands of an 8-year-old prodigy. As the formidable pack of Hell's Angels simultaneously fired up their incredibly loud motorcycles and violently roared out of the cramped parking lot, the sheer noise shook the entire building. They left behind a suffocating, thick gray cloud of toxic exhaust fumes and burning tire smoke that slowly drifted through the open bay doors. Amidst all that chaotic, deafening noise and swirling dust, little Leo just stood, completely frozen in place, tightly clutching the crisp $100 bill against his chest like it was a magical golden ticket to a brand new life. Slowly, the boy turned his head away from the fading roar of the departing biker gang and locked his intense, bright eyes directly onto the cursed 1986 FXR sitting silently on the center lift. The heavy machine looked like a wounded black animal stripped of its armor and waiting desperately for a cure. To everyone else in the frightened shop, the broken-down motorcycle was nothing more than a looming death sentence. But to little Leo, staring at the tangled wires and the raw, exposed steel, it was a massive, incredibly beautiful puzzle, begging to be solved. Standing there in the settling smoke, Leo closed his eyes and could almost physically feel the warm, familiar weight of his late father's heavy hand resting reassuringly on his narrow shoulder. It was a comforting ghost, a silent promise that Artie Hayes was still standing right beside his boy in the dusty garage. The kid took a long, deep breath of the pungent, oil-soaked air, letting the sheer reality of the massive challenge wash entirely over him. The shouting and the dangerous threats were finally over. Now the actual back-breaking real work was about to begin. The cold morning sun had barely begun to bleed a pale, watery orange light over the jagged industrial skyline of Oakland when Leo boldly walked right through the rusty side door of Apex Ironworks on Wednesday morning. He was exactly on time, arriving just as the city was waking up to a brand new day of brutal, grinding labor. The sprawling garage was still wrapped in deep shadows, and the lingering chill of the damp California night, smelling powerfully of stale coffee, old gasoline, and the heavy, nervous sweat of grown men who knew their entire livelihoods were on the line. Let me tell you, when the kid stepped into the light, he looked entirely different. Today, his usually filthy face was scrubbed totally clean, revealing sharp, intelligent features that had been buried under weeks of thick street grime. Even though his hand-me-down clothes were still heavily worn and comically oversized on his skinny frame, something vital had shifted inside him. He did not walk like a frightened stray animal anymore. He carved himself across the concrete floor with a quiet, undeniable purpose, moving with the heavy authority of a seasoned general going to war. The night before, he had actually gone out and bought the massive, thick steak that Jim Mercer had generously paid for. It was without a single doubt the absolute best, most filling meal that he and his struggling mother had shared together in agonizingly long months. His belly was finally full of rich, red meat instead of cheap, empty carbohydrates, giving his small body a desperately needed surge of physical power. He had taken the giant biker's money, he had consumed the massive fuel, and now the fiercely proud kid was completely ready to earn every single penny of it. Now, you have to picture the incredibly strange welcoming committee waiting for him in the center of the shop. Roostai, the nervous owner, was pacing rapidly, flanked closely by his top 3 professional mechanics. First in the lineup was Big Dave, standing there looking like a slightly confused mountain.
Dave was the kind of massive, hulking wrench monkey who could easily snap loose a rusted suspension bolt using nothing but his bare, calloused hands. Yet here he was, awkwardly waiting for strict operational orders from a tiny kid who barely reached his thick leather tool belt. Right next to the heavily tattooed giant was Tommy, a wiry, constantly twitching speed freak who exclusively specialized in perfectly balancing complex carburetors by ear. Tommy was chewing on a toothpick, completely unable to stand entirely still. Rounding out the incredibly tense crew was Old Man Pete, a grumpy, gray-bearded veteran of the trade who had probably forgotten more about heavy mechanical engineering than most people would ever learn in a lifetime. These were grown, hardened men, completely masters of their chosen craft, entirely humbled by a looming gang deadline. Old Man Pete, the busy shop's resident grumpy electrical guru, and the rest of the highly anxious crew were already standing in a tight circle around the looming black 1986 FXR. They all looked totally exhausted, heavily burdened by a terrible, sleepless night, spent desperately worrying about Jim Mercer's violent threats. Their faces were lined with deep, heavy bags under their eyes, and they looked profoundly, deeply skeptical about taking direct orders from a child. But terror is a powerful motivator, and they knew they had absolutely no other choice but to obey. "All right, kid, let us get this circus over with," Rusty said nervously, crossing his arms over his chest in a totally defensive posture. The shop owner was sweating profusely despite the lingering morning chill, looking infinitely more stressed than a nervous soldier actively trying to defuse a live, ticking bomb. Every time somebody dropped a heavy wrench or slammed the metal drawer, Rusty visibly jumped, his terrified mind constantly, expecting a dozen angry Hell's Angels to suddenly bust violently through the front doors, wielding heavy chains and baseball bats. "Jim Mercer practically signed my literal death warrant if this incredibly crazy plan of yours does not actually work," Rusty admitted out loud, his cracking voice betraying his absolute terror to the entire shop. He uncrossed his trembling arms and threw his hands up in a heavy gesture of total surrender. "So congratulations, little man. We are entirely yours to command for the rest of the day." It was a deeply humiliating concession for a pro-ed business owner to make, but survival always trumps ego when you are dealing with violent outlaws demanding absolute perfection. "Where exactly do we start this mess?" Rusty asked, desperately needing a solid direction to calm his rapidly racing heart. Leo did not hesitate for a single microsecond. He completely ignored the heavy sarcasm and the nervous adult energy filling the room, transforming instantly into the absolute boss. The skinny 8-year-old marched purposefully forward, his worn sneakers slapping the concrete, and walked straight over to the heavy right side of the crippled motorcycle. He stared deeply into the complex metal housing, his sharp mind already 10 steps ahead of the grown men. "Take off the heavy aluminum cam cover right away, Mr. Dave, but absolutely make sure you drain out all the thick oil first, unless you want a massive black puddle spilling all over your expensive work boots," Leo commanded, with stunning authority. It was a perfectly executed order, delivered with the casual, completely confident tone of a seasoned veteran who had torn apart 100 engines. He even threw in the incredibly practical warning about the messy oil spill, proving instantly that he understood the actual physical reality of the dirty work they were about to perform. Big Dave just offered a deep, rumbling grunt of total obedience, immediately dropping down to his knees and sliding a stained plastic drain pan precisely under the belly of the heavy bike. And let me tell you, what happened next was truly a sight to behold. For the next 3 agonizingly tense hours, an absolutely bizarre, entirely fascinating ballet unfolded inside the dirty walls of that garage. It was a surreal dance of giant, muscle-bound men handling heavy iron tools, all carefully orchestrated by a tiny, soft-spoken conductor who barely cast a shadow on the floor. These massive grown men, highly seasoned veterans of the heavy wench, who had spent decades mastering their brutal craft, silently and obediently followed the incredibly precise, quietly whispered instructions of an 8-year-old boy. Leo would point to a specific dark corner of the engine block, softly murmur a highly technical torque specification, or a complex sequence of bolts, and the towering mechanics would quickly move in to execute his exact vision. There was no arguing, no egos clashing, just a strange, beautiful harmony born out of pure desperation and raw genius. When the heavy, stubborn aluminum cam cover was finally broken loose and carefully pulled completely away from the main block, it dramatically exposed the dizzyingly complex array of tightly meshed gears hidden deep inside the dark belly of the engine. It looked like the complicated, oily guts of a giant metal clock, a delicate and unforgiving mechanical maze where a single millimeter of error could cause a catastrophic explosion. The mechanics all instinctively leaned in closer, holding their collective breath, desperately waiting to see if the brilliant kid was actually right. Because he was so incredibly small, Leo actually had to drag over a heavy plastic milk crate and physically climb up onto it just to get a proper downward angle to look inside the crankcase. Balancing perfectly on his toes, he reached deeply into his oversized pants pocket and proudly produced a small, heavily battered silver flashlight. With the steady, practiced hand of a seasoned surgeon inspecting an open wound, the young boy clicked the bright beam on and carefully shined it directly onto the heavy steel teeth of the internal flywheel, illuminating the hidden truth. Now, you and I have probably both judged a book by its cover before, but what happens next was pure vindication. "Right there," Leo said confidently, extending a tiny, freshly grease-stained finger directly into the beam of light. "Look closely at the edge of the pinion gear. Do you finally see the hidden timing mark I was talking about?" He held the flashlight perfectly steady, throwing a harsh glare directly onto the crucial piece of metal that had completely baffled the professional mechanics for days. It was exactly where his brilliant father had told him it would be. Rusty quickly pushed his way forward and leaned in close, heavily squinting his tired eyes under the intensely harsh glare of the yellow droplight. The skeptical shop owner wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and stared exactly where the little boy was pointing. Suddenly, Rusty's bloodshot eyes widened in absolute, undeniable shock. "Well, I will be totally damned to hell," Rusty whispered, his voice completely hollowed out by absolute disbelief. The kid is completely right. It is definitely not a standard evolution engine mark stamped onto that piece of metal. It is clearly stamped with a deeply engraved V. That is absolutely an old shovel head gear crammed in there. "Yo, you were entirely right about everything." Leo. Rusty admitted, completely surrendering his pride to the undeniable truth. The legend was real. The boy simply clicked off his flashlight and stepped back down from the plastic crate, totally unfazed by the miraculous discovery that just saved their lives. Mr. Dutch was an absolute mechanical genius, but he was incredibly cheap, Leo said matter-of-factly, ready to put the beast back together and make it scream. The mechanic had taken a heavy steel gear meant for an old shovelhead motor and physically forced it to mate up with a newer Evolution camshaft. If you know anything about classic American iron, you know those two pieces of machinery were absolutely never designed to hold hands. It is the exact kind of rogue engineering that creates a true street monster. But it is also the kind of back-alley modification that completely rewrites the rulebook. Every standard measurement goes straight out the window the second you bolt that case together. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Because this is where the disaster really started. When you build a hybrid setup like that, the factory service manual becomes completely useless. You actually have to advance the ignition timing by exactly 12 degrees past the stock recommendation. If you miss that mark by even a fraction, the spark plug fires at the exact wrong millisecond. Instead of igniting a perfectly pressurized chamber, that spark just slams violently into a massive, heavy wall of uncompressed gasoline. That specific violent kickback was the phantom force working inside the motor, hammering against the internal geometry and bending the pushrods completely out of shape. The absolute terror of that realization hit the room like a physical blow. The pushrod's Tommy let out a sharp, ragged gasp as the blood completely drained from his face. He looks like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine. All that time diagnosing the surface issues,
and the real damage was hiding deep inside the metal belly of the beast. Tommy practically scrambled across the greasy concrete floor to a cluttered workbench in the corner of the bay. Earlier that morning, they had carefully laid out the engine's internal rods on a stained red shop towel, assuming they were perfectly fine. His hands were shaking slightly as he picked one of the long metal shafts up and placed it down against the cold, flat steel of the bench. If a rod is perfectly straight, it will roll smooth as glass. Tommy gave it a hard push, holding his breath, as he watched the metal move. It did not roll smoothly at all. The heavy metal shaft wobbled violently across the steel surface, making a terrible, uneven clattering noise that echoed through the quiet garage. Tommy did not even have to roll the second one to know the truth. He turned around, his eyes wide with sheer panic. "Rusty, they are bent," he stammered out. Every single one of them. That brutal kickback from the incorrect ignition timing completely warped them out of shape. We have been staring at the problem this entire time and missed it. We did not even notice the damage when we pulled them out. Tommy whispered, the guilt heavy in his voice. A sudden, clammy, cold sweat immediately broke out across Rusty's forehead, glistening under the harsh fluorescent shop lights. He wiped his face with the back of a grease-stained hand and stared at the bent metal.
"Are you kidding me right now?"
Rusty shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "This is not some standard factory build we are talking about. This is a highly customized hybrid motor we are dealing with." The nightmare of their situation was rooted in basic, unforgiving math. If they tried to drop a set of standard evolution push rods into that block, the length would completely clash with the steep geometry of that aggressively modified camshaft. And if they tried to go the other route and use older shovelhead components, those rods are fundamentally far too short to even reach the rocker arms. They were trapped in a mechanical no-man's land, caught between two different generations of American engineering, with absolutely no bridge across. The original owner, a legendary biker named Dutch, must have spent hours on a lathe custom machining these exact pieces himself just to make the engine turn over. We cannot just pick up a phone and order these parts from some aftermarket catalog. Rusty explained, the utter hopelessness finally settling in. There is no part number for a ghost. The entire crew of seasoned mechanics fell completely silent. The only sound left in the garage was the faint, mocking drip of oil hitting a plastic drain pan somewhere in the background. The crushing reality of the situation finally came crashing down upon the entire crew, suffocating the air right out of the room. This was not just a missed deadline on a regular customer's weekend cruiser. This was a direct failure to deliver a high-stakes promise to some very dangerous people who did not accept apologies or issue refunds. Every man in the shop suddenly felt the very real weight of what was coming for them, calculating the exact amount of physical danger they had just stumbled into by taking on this cursed project. They had officially diagnosed the true problem, but that victory felt entirely hollow. Without a replacement set of those highly specific, custom-machined parts to properly reassemble the complicated valve train, that heavy iron engine was just as useless and dead as it had been 24 hours ago. A proper fix required a machine shop, exact measurements, and days of trial and error. But time was the one thing they simply did not possess. The shop clock on the wall ticked loudly. It was already late into Wednesday afternoon. They were staring down the barrel of a timeline that gave them less than 48 hours before the original owners returned to collect their property. "We are officially done," Big Dave muttered, his massive shoulders slumping forward in total defeat. He turned around in frustration and launched a heavy steel wrench violently across the room. It slammed into the solid concrete floor with a sharp, deafening clang that made everyone flinch. Dave was a man who rarely lost his cool, which only made his sudden surrender feel that much more permanent. Jim Mercer is absolutely going to burn this entire shop straight to the ground when he finds out we failed. Tommy groaned, already imagining the smell of the smoke. While the grown men in the room were actively spiraling into a state of absolute dread, little 8-year-old Leo simply climbed down from his overturned plastic milk crate. He wiped a streak of dark grease across his cheek and looked at the terrified mechanics. Unlike the adults, the young boy did not look panicked at all. In fact, he looked like he was just getting to work. The small boy quietly walked straight over to the cluttered workbench, totally ignoring the heavy atmosphere of doom filling the shop. He reached up on his tiptoes, grabbed one of the violently bent steel rods, and held it up to the overhead fluorescent light. He narrowed his bright blue eyes, examining the distorted curve of the metal with the quiet intensity of a master builder assessing a flawed foundation. He did not say a word at first, just turning the ruined piece of machinery over and over in his small, heavily stained hands.
"My dad was Mr. Dutch's personal mechanic," Leo said quietly, his soft voice cutting right through the anxious breathing of the grown men. Mr. Dutch broke his toys all the time. He always rode way too hard, pushing the limits of the metal until something eventually had to snap or shatter under the pressure. My dad knew this better than anybody else in the city. He always told me that if you build a machine to run angry, you have to expect it to bite back. Leo placed the bent rod back down onto the red shop towel with a gentle tap. You and I have both seen moments where a single question changes the entire course of a day. This was one of those moments. Leo slowly looked up from the bench and locked his bright blue eyes squarely on Rusty. "Does this old building still have those creepy basement storage lockers down below?" the boy asked. "I am talking about the original steel cages from way back before you bought the property and changed the name on the front sign." The mechanics exchanged totally bewildered glances, completely derailed by the random change in direction. Rusty just blinked a few times, completely thrown off balance by the sudden and bizarre change in subject. He wiped his greasy palms on his denim jeans and nodded slowly. "Yeah, we still have those old storage units," Rusty answered cautiously. "They are buried way down below the custom paint booth on the sublevel of the shop. Nobody has been down there in years, though." The heavy air of impending doom was momentarily replaced by a strong sense of pure, unfiltered curiosity. Why was an 8-year-old as king about the forgotten basement? "It is just incredibly damp, completely unlit, and packed to the ceiling with absolute junk from the previous owners," Rusty added. "Why in the world do you care about the basement right now?" "Locker 42, Leo said without missing a single beat. "My dad rented that exact unit years ago. When he got really sick, when the cancer finally got bad enough that he could not hold a wrench anymore, we just could not afford to pay the monthly rent on the space." The boy spoke about the tragedy with a heartbreaking, matter-of-fact calmness. The grumpy old landlord eventually put a heavy chain on the door and locked it completely up to keep us out. Leo explained, looking back down at the ruined engine parts. "But right before my dad passed away, he told me a secret. He told me that he absolutely never threw away a single one of his custom cuts or special metal fabrications. He poured too much of his own sweat and blood into measuring and machining those parts to just toss them in the garbage. Whatever he built for that bike, he made sure to keep the original blueprints and the backups safe." A small, incredibly proud smile flashed across the young boy's dirt-smudged face as he remembered his father's exact words. He always said that if you are crazy enough to build a Frankenstein monster, you had better be smart enough to keep a whole lot of spare body parts lying around. He knew exactly what this hybrid motor was going to do to its own internal organs over time. He knew it would eventually tear itself apart from the inside out. The absolute brilliance of the dead mechanic's foresight hung heavy in the quiet garage air. Exactly 10 minutes later, the entire rescue mission moved underground. Rusty, armed with a massive pair of heavy yellow bolt cutters, marched straight up to the cage of Locker 42, down in the incredibly damp, dimly lit basement of the shop. He clamped the steel jaws around the deeply rusted padlock and squeezed with all his might until the thick metal violently snapped with a sharp crack. Rusty grabbed the handle and pulled hard. The heavy corrugated metal door squealed open in protest, so unding like a wild animal waking from a long sleep. The air inside that forgotten storage unit was incredibly stale, carrying the distinct, heavy scent of old motor oil, damp concrete, and decay. The overhead single bulb cast long, creepy shadows across the tight rectangular space.
Everything sitting inside that room was completely covered in a shockingly thick layer of undisturbed gray dust and sprawling, sticky spider webs. It looked less like a simple mechanic's storage locker and far more like an ancient tomb that had been strictly sealed away from the outside world for decades. The beam of the flashlight swept across the forgotten treasures of a dead man. Stacked haphazardly in the corners were dozens of rotting cardboard boxes, overflowing with dog-eared vintage motorcycle magazines and deeply rusted hand tools that had long ago lost their shine. But sitting perfectly dead center in the middle of the concrete floor, almost demanding their immediate attention, was a beautifully constructed, heavy wooden crate. It was securely fastened shut, with nothing more than a very simple, tarnished brass latch on the front. Leo did not hesitate for a single second. The young boy immediately dropped down to his knees, right into the thick layer of dirt and dust reaching out, to firmly flip that tarnished brass latch upward. The lid of the crate creaked heavily as he pushed it open. Sitting inside, protected from the brutal dampness of the basement, were several beautifully preserved bundles. Each item was wrapped meticulously in heavy oiled canvas rags. These were not just random spare parts tossed in a bin. They were neatly organized, custom-crafted engine components. The group of grown men crowded around the small boy, holding their collective breath in the murky basement air. With the absolute reverence of an art dealer handling a priceless painting, Leo carefully peeled back the top layer of thick, dark canvas. The beam of Rusty's flashlight hit the fabric, revealing a breathtaking sight. Resting in the folds of the heavy cloth was a perfectly matched set of 4 absolutely pristine, custom-machined push rods. The raw steel gleamed brightly in the darkness, completely untouched by time, rust, or damage. The sheer perfection of the parts was stunning enough, but the real punch to the gut was the label. Carefully attached to the center of the bundle was a highly weathered, incredibly faded piece of yellow masking tape. Written across the rough texture of the tape, in the unmistakable blocky handwriting of a man using a heavily faded black Sharpie marker, were 3 simple words. It read, "Dutch's Widowmaker Spares." The dead mechanic had known exactly what would break, and he had left the cure waiting right here in the dark for all these years. Rusty slowly lowered his flashlight, aiming the beam at the concrete floor as he just stared quietly at the 8-year-old boy. A powerful, overwhelming mixture of genuine awe and absolute unfiltered disbelief washed completely over the seasoned shop owner. They had been dead in the water just 20 minutes ago, and this kid had just handed them a pure miracle wrapped in oiled cloth. Your old man Rusty finally whispered, his voice cracking slightly with emotion in the damp basement air, "Was an absolute saint to leave these behind for us." The young boy gently ran his small thumb over his father's faded handwriting on the old tape. "He was not a saint," Leo corrected him with a very soft, serious tone that sounded far too old for his actual age. "He was a mechanic. He fixed things. Now let us go back upstairs and fix this motorcycle before those men come back." The entire crew hauled the heavy wooden crate up into the main shop bay. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the mechanical crisis was solved, and the entire day of Thursday was consumed by the cursed electrical system. Finding a phantom electrical drain in a custom-built motorcycle is basically like trying to find a single black wire in a totally dark room. But they had the architect's son to guide them. Following little Leo's incredibly precise step-by-step directions, Pete, the shop's resident electrical guru, grabbed his digital multimeter and went to war. He spent hours meticulously tracing every single inch of the copper wiring, hunting down the invisible vampire that was quietly sucking all the cold, cranking amps straight out of the battery overnight. Pete grumbled and cursed under his breath for the better part of the morning, absolutely convinced that the boy had simply misunderstood his late father's overly complex electrical diagrams. But when Pete finally peeled back a thick layer of stiff, heavily melted shrink tubing near the neck of the frame, he abruptly stopped talking. He stared at the exposed copper in total silence. The deeply hidden, perfectly disguised parasitic draw was sitting exactly in the very spot where the 8-year-old kid had calmly promised them it would be waiting. Stick with me for a second, because this is where the genius of the old mechanic really shines. Pete found a secondary heavy-gauge copper wire that had been spliced completely invisibly straight into the main factory ignition harness. This rogue wire ran secretly up the thick steel backbone of the motorcycle frame, completely hidden from view. It finally terminated at a tiny, almost physically imperceptible metal toggle switch that was deeply recessed right into the curved underside of the left side fuel tank, completely hidden by the shadow of the metal. The sheer paranoia required to wire a motorcycle this way was staggering to look at in the bright light of day. This hidden switch was not designed to turn on some fancy accessory lighting or run a secondary horn relay. It was designed as an absolute dead-end security trap for anyone trying to steal the machine. If that tiny metal toggle switch was left in the open position by the rider when they walked away, it created a devastating, invisible loop within the complex wiring harness that would easily fool even the most experienced motorcycle thief. If a thief tried to hotwire the bike with that switch flipped open, the heavy starter motor would aggressively crank over, making it sound exactly like the engine was desperately trying to fire up. But the joke was completely on them. The critical ignition coil was entirely grounded out directly to the bare steel of the frame. That meant the heavy cranking was just rapidly bleeding the battery totally dry, spinning the internal gears without ever delivering a single life-giving spark to the combustion chamber. It was a brilliant, cruel illusion. The shop crew pushed through the absolute exhaustion running purely on black coffee, cold pizza, and the raw adrenaline of a looming deadline. They worked tirelessly as the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on outside the dirty garage windows. Finally, by Thursday night at exactly 11 o'clock, the massive hybrid engine was fully and meticulously reassembled. The heavy chrome covers were bolted down tight. The wiring harness was cleanly tucked away, and the bay was silent except for the heavy breathing of incredibly tired men. Every single crisis had been systematically conquered by the exhausted crew. The pristine custom puss rods from the forgotten basement crate were perfectly installed deep inside the engine block. The notoriously finicky valves were carefully adjusted to the exact thousandth of an inch. The ignition timing, which had nearly ruined them all on Wednesday, was now permanently locked in at that required 12-degree advance. Finally, a brand-new heavy-duty battery was fully charged and securely strapped down inside the battery box. They were finally ready. The gleaming black motorcycle sat quietly in the very center of the garage, looking exactly like a sleeping dragon. "So should we actually fire this thing up and hear it run?" Big Dave asked the room. His massive, grease-stained hand was already hovering eagerly just inches over the chrome ignition key, desperately wanting to hear the engine roar to life to validate their brutal labor. "Absolutely not," Leo said immediately, his firm, unwavering voice echoing out from his familiar resting spot on the overturned plastic milk crate in the corner. The young boy looked completely and utterly physically exhausted by the ordeal. There were deeply dark, bruised-looking bags settling heavily right underneath his incredibly bright blue eyes, betraying just how far past his normal bedtime it truly was. His small, delicate hands were completely coated and stained permanently black with a thick layer of engine grease and road grime that would take a week of intense scrubbing to finally wash away. He looked like a veteran mechanic who had just pulled a triple shift. "Mr. Mercer is the customer," Leo continued. "Mr. Mercer is the man who specifically paid the heavy price to hear this exact machine turn over for the first time," Leo explained to the older men, with cold, undeniable logic. "If we get cocky and start it up right now in the middle of the night, and something deep inside that crankcase suddenly snaps or shatters under the pressure, we have absolutely zero time left on the clock to tear it down and fix it again. We leave it alone. We let the metal sleep. We just wait for tomorrow." The mechanics slowly nodded, stepping away from the tempting machine. When Friday morning finally arrived, it seemed to crawl into the garage with an agonizing, almost suffocating slowness. Every single minute ticking by on the round wall clock felt like an entire hour dragging its feet. The shop was completely spotless. The tools were put away, but nobody was actually doing any new work. The tension in the room was so incredibly dense you could practically taste the metallic anxiety on the back of your tongue. The air inside that normally loud, chaotic garage was painfully thick with pure, unadulterated anticipation. Sitting dead center in the middle of the fiercely scrubbed concrete bay was the pride and joy of the impending threat. The heavily modified 1986 FXR motorcycle had been carefully wiped down, polished to a mirror shine, and inspected a dozen times over. The aggressive rake of the front forks and the deep, glossy black paint job made the heavy iron machine look exactly like a highly dangerous, incredibly dark predator that was simply sitting quietly in a steel cage, patiently waiting for someone foolish enough to come along and unchain it. The waiting game officially ended at exactly 11:45 in the morning. Nobody in the shop actually heard them coming at first, but every single man standing in the room suddenly felt the shift. The cold concrete ground beneath their heavy steel-toed work boots subtly began to tremble and vibrate, rattling the loose socket wrenches sitting on the aluminum tool carts. It was a deep, rhythmic shaking that traveled straight up through their legs and settled directly into the pits of their nervous stomachs. The deadline had officially arrived. That ominous physical vibration quickly translated into an unmistakable wall of sound. It started off as a very low, menacing, bass-heavy rumble echoing from several blocks away down the industrial avenue. Within seconds, that distant growl was growing steadily and aggressively louder, bouncing violently off the brick buildings lining the street. Before anyone could even walk over to look out the roll-up garage door, the noise swelled into an absolute, deafening, mechanical thunder that completely drowned out every other sound in the entire neighborhood. You and I both know that in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs, a promise is completely binding and a failure is never forgiven. The local chapter of the Hells Angels had officially returned to collect what was theirs, but this time around, the stakes were visually much higher than they had been on Monday. It was no longer just a casual scouting party of a half-dozen casual riders dropping off a broken bike. The sheer volume of the roaring exhaust pipes outside heavily suggested that the enforcer had brought a very large, very angry audience with him. A tightly grouped pack of at least 20 heavily patched bikers rolled aggressively into the small asphalt parking lot in front of the shop. They killed their roaring engines in a deeply synchronized wave of sudden silence that was almost more terrifying than the actual noise. The men climbed off their saddles and quickly formed up shoulder to shoulder, creating a massive, terrifying, impenetrable human wall of sun-baked black leather, highly polished chrome chains, and raw, unfiltered physical intimidation that completely blocked out the midday sun. Riding directly at the front of the terrifying pack was the massive enforcer himself. Jim Mercer sharply killed his roaring twin-cam engine with a quick flick of his leather-gloved thumb, and aggressively kicked his heavy steel kickstand down against the asphalt with a loud scrape. He slowly stood up and stepped entirely off his custom motorcycle, adjusting the heavy leather cut resting on his broad shoulders. His deeply weathered, heavily scarred face was completely unreadable, frozen in an incredibly tight, merciless mask of hardened gray stone. The giant enforcer did not bother waiting for an invitation to enter the building. Jim walked slowly and deliberately straight into the main garage bay, his incredibly heavy, steel-toed engineer boots echoing loudly, like a judge's gavel against the eerily quiet concrete floor of the shop. The rest of the intimidating motorcycle club silently filed into the room right behind him, fanning out defensively to block the only exit. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the shadows, slowly crossing their muscular arms and staring coldly at the terrified mechanics. Every single pair of cold, hardened eyes in that room immediately locked onto the gleaming black FXR motorcycle, sitting perfectly still in the dead center of the service bay. Nobody said a single word about the beautiful polish job. Rusty was currently backed up as far as he could physically go, awkwardly pinning himself right against his massive red snap-on toolbox. He was sweating absolutely profusely, heavy beads of nervous perspiration rolling rapidly down the side of his pale face, completely ignoring the crisp, cool morning air flowing inside. The rest of the shop crew was not faring any better, under the intense pressure of the silent bikers. Big Dave, Tommy, and Pete had unconsciously shuffled backwards, clustering tightly together directly behind their terrified boss. They stood completely rigid, their hands nervously shoved deep into their greasy jean pockets, looking exactly like a group of doomed men who had just been forcefully lined up right against a brick wall to face an active firing squad. All the mechanical confidence they had built up the night before had instantly, completely evaporated. Amidst all the absolute knee-shaking terror radiating from the fully grown mechanics, there was exactly one person in the room who did not take a single step backwards. Only 8-year-old Leo remained boldly standing directly next to the highly polished black motorcycle. He was casually holding onto the wooden handle of his large shop push broom, looking completely undisturbed. The tiny boy just tilted his chin up, staring directly into the terrifying eyes of the towering club enforcer, as if they were just old friends passing on the street. It was Friday. The heavy, suffocating silence hanging in the garage stretched on for what felt like an absolute eternity before the giant biker finally decided to break it. High noon. Jim Mercer casually stated, his incredibly deep, gravelly voice effortlessly cutting right through the thick layers of pure tension filling the room. He slowly pulled off his heavy leather riding gloves, casually slapping them against his massive thigh, as he finally shifted his icy, predatory gaze away from the motorcycle and locked his intimidating stare directly onto the terrified shop owner. "I am only going to ask you this question exactly one time," Jim rumbled, taking a slow step forward. "So tell me, right now, is that thing sitting over there a functioning motorcycle, or is it just an expensive pile of useless scrap metal?" Rusty swallowed incredibly hard, his throat suddenly as dry as sandpaper. Instead of proudly defending the grueling 72 hours of highly technical labor his crew had just desperately performed, the terrified boss took another cowardly step backward and nervously pointed a shaking finger right at the 8-year-old boy. "It is entirely all on the kid," Jim Rusty aggressively stammered out his panicked voice, completely cracking under the intense scrutiny of 20 hardened bikers. "I am telling you the absolute truth right now. Every single wrench we turned, we did exactly what that little boy right there told us to do. We just followed his blueprints step by step to put the engine back together." Rusty practically threw the young child directly under the approaching bus, utterly desperate to deflect the violent wrath of the motorcycle club away from his own sweating crew. A slight, incredibly dangerous frown deeply creased the giant enforcer's heavily scarred forehead as he processed the bizarre excuse. Jim slowly, deliberately turned his icy, unblinking gaze away from the pathetic shop owner and looked downward at the small, grease-stained boy holding the push broom. He studied the kid for a long, totally silent moment, evaluating the absolute lack of fear in the young boy's bright blue eyes. Then, without uttering a single word of response, the massive biker turned and walked heavily over to the side of the black FXR. The giant man approached the beautiful machine with the exact same slow caution you would use when approaching a highly venomous snake. He gently reached out and ran his massive, calloused, bare hand smoothly over the immaculate curve of the custom black leather seat. Satisfied, he stepped forward and firmly gripped the thick, heavy chrome handlebars with both hands. With a surprisingly fluid motion for a man of his incredible size, he swung his thick, muscular leg right over the wide frame, heavily settling his enormous physical weight deep into the low saddle. The entire room collectively stopped breathing at the exact same time. Jim reached down beside his thick thigh and firmly grabbed the silver ignition key, twisting it sharply to the right. Instantly, the heavy electrical relays clicked loudly, and the massive, bright halogen headlight flickered beautifully to life, aggressively illuminating the dirty brick wall sitting directly across the service bay. The glowing amber dashboard gauges swept cleanly from left to right. Jim took his hand off the key, looked directly down at little Leo, and raised one thick eyebrow. "Well then, I guess this is the absolute moment of truth, kid," Jim rumbled softly, his deep voice carrying a terrifying hint of finality. He reached up with his massive left hand and squeezed the heavy chrome clutch lever aggressively tight against the handlebar grip. The giant biker took one deep, highly focused breath to brace himself, moved his thick right thumb over the controls, and forcefully slammed it down hard onto the electric starter button. The heavy mechanical relays immediately snapped shut with a loud click, followed by a desperate, high-pitched whir. Whir. The incredibly heavy, high-torque starter motor instantly engaged and began forcefully spinning the internal crankshaft beautifully and cleanly, exactly the way a freshly rebuilt hybrid engine absolutely should turn over. The mechanical geometry was totally flawless. The heavy pistons were aggressively pumping perfectly up and down inside the freshly oiled cylinders. But the heavy iron beast adamantly refused to wake up. The heavily modified Evolution motor absolutely would not catch, stubbornly refusing to ignite the highly pressurized fuel mixture. Despite the aggressive, high-speed cranking of the starter motor, there was absolutely no life-giving spark jumping across the wide gaps of the spark plugs. Without that critical flash of extreme heat, there was zero explosive combustion happening inside those tight steel walls. The shop was filled entirely with the hollow, incredibly depressing metallic sound of a completely dead, soulless machine, hopelessly turning over and over again. It sounded exactly like an expensive pile of heavy scrap metal, desperately trying to pretend it was a real motorcycle. Hearing that sickening, empty mechanical sound violently cranking away Rusty's terrified heart immediately plummeted straight down into the very bottom of his churning stomach. Over by the toolbox, Big Dave just slowly closed his heavy eyelids, completely resigning himself to the physical beating that was undoubtedly coming their way. Standing tightly together near the garage entrance, the massive wall of intimidating, leather-clad bikers began nervously shifting their heavy weight from side to side, a highly dangerous, violent murmur suddenly rippling through the angry crowd. The painful, high-pitched whining of the struggling engine abruptly died out. Jim slowly and deliberately pulled his massive, heavily tattooed thumb completely off the chrome starter button, killing the electrical current and letting the heavy internal pistons rapidly drag themselves to a deeply disappointing, silent halt. The sudden lack of mechanical noise in the garage was absolutely deafening, leaving behind only the terrifying, angry whispers of the 20 dangerous men standing guard at the front door. The deadline had officially passed, and they had failed. You might expect a violent explosion here, but that is not how dangerous men really operate. Jim did not scream. He did not punch a hole through the gas tank. Surprisingly, he did not actually look angry at all. Instead, staring blankly ahead, he just looked profoundly, almost heartbreakingly disappointed by the entire pathetic situation. He slowly began to shake his large, heavy head in total disgust, preparing to step off the dead machine. But before his steel-toed boot could hit the floor, a tiny voice cut through the room. "You completely forgot, Leo," said clearly. That single, small, incredibly calm voice, echoing out from beside the dead motorcycle, absolutely instantly silenced every single terrifying murmur rippling through the angry crowd of bikers. The room went so totally quiet, you could have easily heard a stray washer drop onto the concrete. Jim completely froze his movements, slowly turning his massive, heavily bearded head to look directly back down at the small boy standing, entirely unfazed beside his leg. The giant enforcer's thick, scarred brow deeply furrowed in a mixture of total confusion and sudden sharp curiosity. The intimidating biker stared intensely at the fearless 8-year-old child standing boldly in front of him. "I forgot exactly what?" Jim asked, his deep, gravelly voice perfectly level demanding, a very good answer to spare the room from violence. Leo did not flinch or back away from the heavy glare. Instead, the young boy actually took one confident step much closer to the massive man and the motorcycle. He slowly raised his small hand and pointed his deeply grease-stained index finger straight directly toward the dark underside of the left side of the shiny fuel tank. "You completely forgot to use Mr. Dutch's special security trick before you hit the starter."
Mr. Mercer, Leo explained with the gentle patience of a teacher correcting a deeply forgetful student. You have to reach your hand right up underneath the bottom curve of the left side fat bob tank and flip the hidden toggle switch, or the coil just grounds out to the bare metal frame to drain the main battery. The giant enforcer instantly froze completely solid, his wide eyes locking intensely onto the young boy's dirt-smudged face as the forgotten memory finally struck him. A profound, absolutely undeniable look of sudden, powerful realization violently washed completely over the giant biker's heavily weathered, deeply scarred face. He had watched his dead brother perform that exact same bizarre ritual 100 different times over the years, and in the overwhelming heat of the moment, he had entirely forgotten the trap existed. Moving very slowly, as if he was entirely caught in a dream, Jim blindly reached his massive, heavily calloused left hand deep underneath the smooth, glossy curve of the black sheet metal of the customized fuel tank. The entire garage, full of terrified mechanics and hardened outlaw bikers, held their collective breath in total silence, watching the giant enforcer's arm move. His incredibly thick, calloused fingers blindly searched the dark, completely hidden recess of the cold metal, sliding gently along the smooth edge of the iron frame backbone, exactly where the young boy had told him to look. Then suddenly he felt it. His thumb lightly brushed against the tiny, almost totally invisible metal toggle switch hiding in the shadows. He smiled and firmly clicked the switch upward. Let me tell you a story about a moment where everything changed. Picture a tiny metal toggle switch tucked away so perfectly that no one but the person who built it would ever know it was there, completely hidden from view under the heavy steel frame. A sharp, distinct click echoed in the quiet garage as Jim flipped it. He pulled his large, calloused hand back slowly, almost like he was touching something sacred. He shot a long, unreadable look at little Leo standing nearby. Then, with a heavy sigh that carried years of memories, Jim reached out and firmly gripped the thick leather handlebars once again, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. He took a deep breath and pressed his thumb against the heavy, black starter button. For a split second, there was nothing but a mechanical catch, a deep rumble, and then a row of sparks. Suddenly, the massive engine erupted into life with a terrifying, violent explosion of raw sound that hit you right in the chest. It was not just loud, it was an earth-shattering roar that seemed to suck all the air right out of the damp garage. You could feel the concrete floor vibrating under your boots. The sheer force of the noise felt like a physical blow. A massive wave of pure American horsepower waking up from a long, deep sleep. To say the machine simply started would be the biggest understatement of the century. It did not just turn over and idle, it absolutely detonated into life. It was like a bomb going off inside a steel cage. The initial blast of combustion ripped through the air, completely shattering the tense silence that had hung over the shop all morning. It was a violent, chaotic explosion of gasoline and spark, transforming dead metal into a living, breathing monster in a fraction of a second. Everyone standing around jumped back instinctively, completely unprepared for the sheer brutality of a motor that refused to wake up quietly. The thick, unbaffled straight pipes unleashed a deafening rhythmic thunder that bounced hard off the concrete walls. It was a brutal percussion that reached up and literally shook decades of gray dust free from the wooden rafters high above. Down on the floor, heavy steel wrenches and sockets began to dance and rattle violently inside their red metal tool chests. The deep bass of the exhaust note was so intense it blurred your vision for a second. It felt less like a motorcycle running and more like an earthquake rolling directly through the center of the ironworks, vibrating through every solid surface and rattling the teeth in your jaw. Anyone who knows motorcycles will tell you there is a very specific melody to a race-tuned engine. This was not the smooth, predictable hum of a factory machine. It was the distinct, uneven, heavy-hitting idle of a heavily modified, high-compression V-twin block. You know that sound? That loping, staggering heartbeat that sounds like the motor is choking on its own power before catching itself at the very last millisecond.
Chug, pause, bang. Chug, pause, bang. It was the aggressive, unmistakable rhythm of a Machin running so close to the ragged edge of destruction that it demanded absolute respect from anyone brave enough to throw a leg over it. Standing there in the hazy light, the machine truly sounded like an angry, desperate beast that had finally been let off its heavy iron leash after years in captivity. It growled and snapped, spitting raw attitude into the dusty air. Jim Mercer sat squarely on the leather seat, his face set like carved stone. He reached down and firmly twisted the throttle grip, cracking the intake wide open. In that fraction of a second, the beast did not just roar, it screamed. The sudden rush of fuel and air ignited, turning that uneven, loping idle into a pure, concentrated howl of mechanical fury that washed over every single person in the room. The massive engine roared right back at him, sending out a solid wall of pure mechanical aggression that hit the crowd like a hurricane. It was so pie-ricingly loud that Rusty and the older, hardened mechanics instinctively slapped their hands over their ears, their faces twisting in a mix of pain and pure awe. You have to understand, these were guys who spent 10 hours a day listening to metal grind against metal. But this was on an entirely different level. The hear volume pushed the physical limits of the small building, threatening to blow the frosted windows right out of their rusted steel frames. It was glorious, untamed chaos. Bright blue and orange fire spat violently from the slashed ends of the exhaust pipes, lighting up the dim corners of the shop with every crack of the throttle. The sound cutting through the smoke was absolutely, undeniably perfect. It was a masterpiece of tuning and timing. Slowly, deliberately, Jim rolled off the gas and let the huge bike settle back down into its heavy, thumping idle. The frantic screaming faded, replaced once again by that menacing, uneven heartbeat. The flames flickered out, leaving only the sharp smell of unburned gasoline and hot oil hanging thick in the air, a scent that every biker knows deep in their soul. Jim did not move to turn it off right away. He just sat there, straddling the massive frame for a very long moment, his boots planted firmly on the greasy concrete. He closed his eyes, simply feeling the intense, bone-rattling vibration of the huge engine transferring up through the metal and directly into his body. It was as if he was trying to absorb the soul of the machine, reading the vital signs of the iron and steel below him. In a world full of noise and constant trouble, this heavy, shaking rhythm was the only thing that felt completely right. He sat perfectly still, letting the thunder wash away the stress of the past few agonizing weeks. Now, if you knew Jim Mercer, you would know he was not a man who showed weakness. But right there in front of everyone, thick and entirely unexpected, tears welled up in the deep corners of the old enforcer's eyes. This was as a giant of a man who had survived bar fights, broken bones, and decades of riding through the absolute worst storms imaginable without ever blinking. Yet listening to the steady, perfect pulse of that resurrected engine, his tough exterior finally cracked. The tears spilled over his weathered cheeks, disappearing into his thick gray beard. He did not bother wiping them away. Some emotions are just too big for pride to hold back. Those tears fell because this was not just the noise of a well-tuned motorcycle. It was the exact, unmistakable sound of his deceased best friend. Every pop, every staggered breath of the exhaust pipe carried Artie's signature touch. It was the sound of 1992 all over again. It was the soundtrack of endless summer nights tearing down the coastal highways when they were young, fearless, and convinced they would live forever. Hearing that engine run flawlessly was like hearing a ghost speak from the other side of the room. The past had suddenly crashed right into the present, carried on the back of combustion and roaring steel. Above all else, it was the absolute sound of brotherhood. It was a mechanical reminder of a bond forged in grease, blood, and thousands of miles of open road. Jim took one final deep breath of the exhaust fumes, reached down with a gloved hand, and firmly hit the red kill switch. The engine coughed once and died. Instantly, the small garage descended into a ringing, stunned silence. The echo of the thunder still bounced around inside everyone's skull, leaving a heavy ringing in their ears. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody even moved. They just stood there, caught in the overwhelming gravity of a moment that felt a lot like a holy resurrection. Breaking the heavy trance, Jim slowly swung his heavy leather boot over the seat and stepped off the massive black bike. He moved with a careful, almost reverent slowness, making sure the kickstand was locked securely onto the concrete before he fully let go of the handlebars. He patted the painted gas tank, once a gentle gesture of deep respect, like you would soothe a trusted horse after a hard run. The air in the shop was still thick with tension, and every single pair of eyes was glued to the giant of a man. The sheer physical presence of the enforcer commanded total silence as he turned his back on the machine and faced the small crowd. Without saying a word, he walked directly over to where the shop owner was standing. He reached his massive hand deep into the inner pocket of his worn leather vest and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. With a sudden, aggressive motion, he slapped the fat package hard against Rusty's chest. The solid thud of the paper hitting the mechanic's greasy work shirt echoed clearly in the quiet room. It was not an act of anger, but a statement of absolute finality. Business was being settled here and now, and Jim was a man who always paid his debts in full, exactly when he said he would. Rusty fumbled for a second before grabbing the envelope. "That is the $5,000 I owe you," Jim said, his deep, gravelly voice unexpectedly thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. He had to pause for a fraction of a second to swallow the lump forming in his throat. "And there is an extra $2,000 in there for the rush job." The words hung heavy in the hazy air. This was a small fortune in cash, handed over without a single complaint or request for a discount. Jim stared hard at the shop owner, his dark eyes demanding that the man recognize the sheer magnitude of what had just been accomplished in this dirty, oil-stained room. The motorcycle was absolutely flawless, and it was worth every single penny. Rusty gripped the thick paper envelope with visibly shaking hands, looking down at the massive pile of cash like it was radioactive. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around nervously before meeting the biker's intense gaze. "Jim, I did not do it," Rusty stammered, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "I just turned the wrenches where I was told. It was all him." The older mechanic slowly raised a trembling, grease-stained finger and pointed across the cluttered garage. He was refusing the glory, refusing to take credit for a miracle he simply could not comprehend. He knew exactly who the real architect of this mechanical masterpiece was. Following the mechanic's trembling finger, Jim turned his massive frame to look directly at little Leo. The young boy was quietly leaning against his wooden push broom over by the heavy steel workbench, looking incredibly small in the shadows of the large tools. Despite the grease smudged across his pale cheeks and the heavy dark circles under his eyes, there was a small, tired, incredibly proud smile resting on his face. He looked like a soldier who had just survived a massive battle and knew he had done his duty perfectly. The boy did not flinch away from the terrifying biker. He just stood there, completely calm, holding his ground like a grown man. The giant enforcer walked slowly across the room, closing the distance between them. Then, in a move that shocked everyone watching, Jim Mercer lowered his massive frame and knelt down on one knee. He completely ignored the thick black grease and metal shavings coating the concrete floor, ruining his good denim jeans without a second thought. He lowered his huge shoulders, bringing his scarred, weathered face right down to eye level with the young 8-year-old boy. The sheer size difference was staggering, like a mountain in bowing down to a small sapling. But the respect flowing from the hardened outlaw toward the small child was absolute and completely real. "Your daddy, Artie." Jim began, his deep voice dropping to a remarkably soft, gentle rumble that barely carried across the quiet garage. He was the finest mechanic I ever knew in all my years on the road. The big man paused, his eyes locked onto the boy's face, searching for the familiar spark of his lost brother. "I honestly thought when he died, all his incredible magic died right along with him,"
The pain of that old loss was written plainly across the biker's face, a heavy burden he had carried for far too long. He spoke to the child not as a kid, but as an equal, sharing a piece of his own broken heart with the only person who could truly understand it. "I was wrong," Jim whispered, a rare smile finally breaking through his thick gray beard. The admission hung in the air, powerful and deeply healing. "Let me tell you, it is not every day a man like Jim admits he made a mistake, especially about something this close to his soul." Slowly, the big man reached his thick fingers up behind his neck and felt blindly for the hidden clasp. With a quiet metal click, he unclasped a heavy, tarnished silver chain from around his own throat. He pulled it completely free from his dark leather vest, letting the thick links slide across his calloused palm. The room went dead silent as everyone realized exactly what he was doing. Dangling heavily from the bottom of that thick chain was a small, solid, silver, winged skull. This was not some cheap trinket you buy at a roadside rally. It was a sacred medallion, an emblem of ultimate respect, given out only to the absolute closest, most fiercely trusted friends of the motorcycle club. Very few men outside the Brotherhood ever earned the right to touch one, let alone own it. With hands that had broken jaws and built iron machines, Jim gently leaned forward and carefully looped the heavy silver chain right around little Leo's neck. He settled the chain over the boy's collar with the gentle care of a father placing a crown on a young king. The heavy chunk of polished silver dropped down and rested squarely against the center of the young boy's oversized, oil-stained cotton t-shirt. It caught the dim shop light gleaming brightly against the dark fabric. "You wear this," Jim told the boy, his deep voice shifting from a gentle whisper into a tone of absolute authority. The words carried the heavy, unbreakable weight of a blood promise. It was a vow made in front of witnesses, binding the massive, dangerous motorcycle club to this fragile little kid. Jim's eyes burned with an intense, fierce, protective fire that left absolutely no room for misunderstanding or debate from anyone standing nearby. "Listen to me very closely," Jim continued, making sure the boy understood the immense power resting against his chest. "If anyone in this entire city ever gives you or your mother a hard time, if anyone ever causes you trouble, no matter who they are, you just pull this out from under your shirt and you show them that silver skull." The enforcer's words were a heavy, ironclad insurance policy wrapped in a soft tone. He was handing the kid a permanent shield against the cruel reality of the rough streets outside the garage doors. The message was incredibly clear. Touching this boy meant answering to 50 heavily armed men who did not care about the local laws. You look them right in the eye and you tell them that you are permanently under the protection of the Oakland chapter, Jim stated firmly, making sure every syllable landed with maximum impact. This was the highest level of security anyone could ever hope to have in this gritty industrial town. By speaking those specific words, Jim was officially drawing a massive, invisible line in the dirt around Leo and his struggling mother. To cross that line was an absolute death sentence. It was a massive shift for a family that had been barely scraping by on scraps. From this moment forward, they would never have to walk through the dangerous neighborhoods in fear again. Young Leo looked down at the heavy silver medallion resting against his chest, his large brown eyes wide with absolute shock and pure wonder. He wrapped his small, grease-stained fingers around the cool metal, feeling the deeply engraved wings of the skull. "Thank you, sir," the boy whispered, his voice trembling just a little bit from the overwhelming emotion of the moment. With a final reassuring nod, Jim Mercer slowly stood back up. His thick knees popped in the quiet room as he rose, his massive frame towering high over the tiny boy once again. The giant enforcer looked down at the kid, knowing his old friend would be incredibly proud of the man his son was becoming. Jim then slowly shifted his intense dark gaze away from the child and locked eyes directly with the shop owner standing nearby. "Rusty!" Jim barked out his voice, returning to its normal booming volume that commanded total obedience. "Things are going to change around here, starting today. The boy officially works for you now."
He pointed a thick, calloused finger right at the stunned mechanic's chest. This was not a friendly suggestion or a casual request to help out a neighborhood kid. It was a direct, firm, and absolute order from a man who absolutely never took no for an answer. Rusty stood up incredibly straight, swallowing hard as he absorbed the sudden command. "I am talking about an official apprenticeship, right here in this shop," Jim declared, laying down the strict rules of the new arrangement. "You are going to pay him a real fair wage every single week, not just pocket change. And more importantly, you're going to patiently teach him exactly how to properly use his hands so his physical skills can finally catch up and match that brilliant giant brain he has inside his head." The outlaw wanted to make absolutely sure that this kid's rare inherited genius was nurtured and protected, rather than exploited or wasted sweeping dirty floors for free. He was building a solid foundation for the boy's entire future. "And listen to me," Jim added, his voice echoing loudly across the shop floor. "When he turns 18 years old, the club is officially stepping in. We are paying his full tuition to go to a real engineering school. Do we have a crystal clear understanding on this?" The old biker narrowed his eyes, waiting for confirmation. He was completely rewriting the boy's destiny right there on the spot. A kid who was destined for poverty was suddenly being handed a golden ticket, backed by the terrifying financial power of a notorious motorcycle gang. It was a beautiful, unexpected collision of brute force and incredible generosity that left the whole room completely stunned. Rusty did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. He nodded his head vigorously, looking almost relieved to be part of the grand plan. "Yes, Jim, absolutely," the nervous shop owner replied quickly. "We would be incredibly honored to have him working here full-time." The deal was permanently struck, sealed verbally in front of the entire crew. Satisfied that his absolute will had been understood and accepted, Jim Mercer finally broke eye contact. He slowly pivoted his heavy boots on the greasy concrete floor and turned his complete attention back to the massive, beautifully restored black FXR motorcycle sitting perfectly on the metal lift in the center of the bay. As Jim looked at the gleaming black paint and perfectly polished chrome of the restored machine, he actually smiled. It was a completely genuine, unexpectedly warm expression that instantly and entirely transformed his deeply scarred, intimidating face. The heavy scowl he wore like armor simply melted away, revealing a glimpse of the younger, happier man he used to be before the rough miles had hardened him. For just a brief, fleeting moment, he did not look like a fearsome outlaw enforcer at all. He just looked like a normal guy who had finally found his way back home after a long, dark stretch on the road. It was a beautiful sight that the rest of the club rarely ever got to witness. "All right, brothers," Jim suddenly yelled over his shoulder to the waiting pack of leather-clad men, his booming voice shattering the quiet, emotional moment. "Let us get moving and load her up on the ramp. Dutch has a very important ride to lead tomorrow morning, and he needs his machine." Instantly, the heavy tension in the garage completely evaporated. The rugged bikers erupted into loud, rowdy cheers, clapping each other on the back as they quickly sprang into action. They began expertly maneuvering the large, heavy flatbed tow truck closer to the open garage bay doors, the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with the lingering scent of unburned motorcycle fuel in the morning air. While the loud, chaotic flurry of activity completely consumed the center of the garage, young Leo simply stayed standing quietly near the edge of the heavy steel workbench. He remained perfectly still, completely separated from the noise of the rushing men. Slowly, deliberately, the boy's grease-stained fingers lightly traced the sharp, deeply engraved outline of the heavy silver skull resting over his racing heart. He was trying to process the massive, life-altering shift that had just occurred in a matter of minutes. The cold metal felt grounding, serving as a permanent physical anchor to his late father, and a solid promise of a deeply secure, highly protected future. As the massive bikers moved around the shop, securing the cargo, Big Dave, a hulking mountain of a man covered in faded ink, walked heavily past the workbench. Instead of ignoring the kid, The giant paused for just a brief second. He reached out with a massive, heavily calloused hand and gently, almost playfully, ruffled the young boy's messy brown hair. It was a simple, wordless gesture of complete acceptance into their strange, aggressive family. Big Dave offered a quick, knowing wink before continuing on his way to grab a heavy ratchet strap. Little Leo just smiled up at him, finally realizing that these terrifying men were not monsters at all. They were his new guardians. The heavy, lingering ghost that had haunted Apex Ironworks for the past month had finally been completely exorcised from the building. But the truly amazing part is how it happened. It was not solved by a highly paid team of master mechanics wearing clean uniforms, armed with fancy diagnostic computers and expensive factory manuals. It was not fixed by throwing thousands of dollars at corporate experts who thought they knew everything about combustion. The great mechanical puzzle that had stumped the absolute best wrenchers in the city was quietly conquered in the dusty shadows of a failing shop by someone entirely unexpected. Someone the rest of the world had completely ignored. The impossible problem was solved by a brave, tired 8-year-old boy, armed with absolutely nothing but the fading memory of his late father and a thick layer of black grease covering his small hands. You and I both know how rare it is to see someone so completely discounted rise up and do the impossible. It is an absolutely incredible, true story of pure heart, relentless grit, and the incredible magic that happens when you finally choose to believe in the ultimate underdog. Against all odds, little Leo had rebuilt a broken machine, and in the process, completely managed to rebuild the broken spirits of the roughest, toughest men roaming the California highways. As we wrap up this incredible story, I want to ask you a simple question. If young Leo's unbelievable courage, his deep loyalty, and his rare mechanical genius inspired you, even half as much as it inspired those hardened bikers, today, please take just a quick second to hit that like button below. It truly makes a huge difference. Go ahead and share this powerful, uplifting story with your closest friends, your family, or anyone else out there who desperately needs a solid reminder that sometimes the absolute biggest heroes come in the smallest, most unexpected packages. Stories like this deserve to be told, and your support helps keep the memory of these garage miracles alive. Also, before you head out, please do not forget to subscribe directly to our channel for plenty more amazing, heartwarming, and gritty real-life dramas just like this one. We are constantly digging up incredible tales of survival brotherhood and the triumph of the human spirit. Make sure you also reach down and hit that little notification bell icon right now. By doing that, you guarantee that you will absolutely never miss a sudden twist, a dramatic turn, or a totally inspiring conclusion in the stories we share. Stick with us, because the world is full of fascinating hidden legends waiting to be uncovered, and we want you riding right alongside us for every single one. Thank you so much for taking the time to stop by, listen to this tale, and share in the incredible legacy of Artie Jim and Little Leo. It is viewers exactly like you who make sharing these powerful narratives so incredibly rewarding for our entire team. Take care of yourselves out there. Keep looking out for the quiet underdogs in your own neighborhoods. And always remember to pay your respects to the people who paved the way before you. We have plenty more amazing content coming your way very soon. So stay safe, keep the rubber side down on the highway, and I will absolutely see you all right back here for the very next video. Until then, keep the good stories rolling.